Imagine a frontier at dusk. Not a border drawn on a map, not a line on paper, not a fence or a wall. Imagine a true frontier, a living edge of the world, in the rolling hills of northwestern Anatolia, in the last years of the 13th century, in the long blue hour when the sun has gone down behind the western ridges, and the first stars are coming out over the highlands, and the cooking fires are being lit in a scattering of tents and low houses on a hillside, and somewhere a flock of sheep is being brought down off the high pasture for the night, the bells around their necks making a soft irregular music in the gathering dark. The air is cool and clean, and smells of wood smoke and dust and the dry grass of late summer. Below the hill, the land falls away westward toward distant valleys you cannot quite see, valleys that belong, still, to another world, an old world, a Christian world, the world of the dying empire of the Romans, whose capital glittered on its golden horn far to the west. And on this hillside, in these tents, among these herders and horsemen and holy men and warriors of the frontier, something is beginning that no one watching the sheep come down the hill that evening could possibly have imagined. Something that will grow from this small and obscure beginning on the edge of everything into one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. An empire that will last more than 600 years, that will rule 3 continents, that will take the ancient imperial city that has stood unconquered for 1,000 years, that will carry its banners to the gates of Vienna and its fleets across the whole of the Mediterranean, and that will shape the history of Europe and Asia and Africa down to our own day. This is the world of the first Ottomans, and it is where we will begin tonight, on the frontier, at dusk, in the small beginning, before any of the greatness, when they were nothing but one band among many on the edge of a collapsing world. Because that is the most astonishing thing about the Ottoman story, the thing to hold on to through the whole long night ahead, that it began so small. There were dozens of little Turkish principalities scattered across Anatolia in those years, dozens of frontier lords with their warbands and their flocks and their ambitions, and there was no reason on earth to think that this one, this obscure band, led by a chieftain named Osman, in the hills near a town called Soyut, would be the one to rise above all the others, to swallow its rivals and cross into Europe, and take the great city and build the empire. It should, by every reasonable expectation, have remained what it was, a footnote, a small frontier lordship, forgotten by history within a generation or two. Instead it became the Ottoman Empire, and how that happened, how a band of frontier herders and horsemen on the edge of the world became the masters of an empire that ruled from Budapest to Baghdad, from the Crimea to the coasts of Yemen, is one of the great stories of human history, and it is the story we will follow tonight, from the dusk on the hillside to the golden age and beyond. So let the frontier settle around you. Let the cooking fires be lit on the darkening hill. Let the sheep come down off the high pasture with their soft bells ringing, and let the first stars come out over Anatolia, over the small obscure beginning of the thing that would become an empire, and we will begin, where all empires begin, with a single man and a dream. To understand how the Ottomans rose, you must first understand the world they were born into, because it was a world in pieces, a world between orders, a world whose old certainties had collapsed, and whose new shape had not yet formed. And it was precisely in that gap, that moment of breakdown and opportunity, that the Ottomans found their chance. Anatolia at the end of the 13th century was a land that had been broken and remade several times over within living memory, and the fragments were still settling. For centuries, Anatolia, the great peninsula that is the Asian heart of modern Turkey, had been the eastern heartland of the Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking, Christian continuation of the Roman Empire, ruled from the magnificent city of Constantinople on the Bosphorus, the largest and richest city in the Christian world. But the Byzantine hold on Anatolia had been broken, 2 centuries before our story begins, by the coming of the Turks. The Turkish peoples had originated far to the east, in the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic horsemen, herders, warriors, speakers of the Turkic languages, who had over centuries migrated westward in wave after wave, converting along the way to Islam, entering the world of the Middle East as soldiers and then as rulers. In the 11th century, a Turkish dynasty, the Seljuks, had shattered a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, one of the decisive battles of history, and thrown open the gates of Anatolia to Turkish settlement. Across the following 2 centuries, Turkish nomads and warriors had poured into Anatolia, and the great peninsula had been transformed, its population, its language, its religion slowly shifting, the Byzantine Greek and Christian world giving way, region by region to a Turkish and Muslim one, in one of the great demographic and cultural transformations of the medieval world. The Seljuks of Anatolia had built a state, the Sultanate of Rum. Rum meaning Rome, for they ruled the old land of the Romans, with a brilliant court culture centered on the city of Konya, a flowering of Persian-influenced art and architecture and poetry. It was in this world that the great mystic poet Rumi lived and wrote, in 13th century Konya, his verses of divine love that are read and loved around the world to this day. But the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had itself been broken by the most terrifying force of the age, the Mongols. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, the explosion of nomadic power out of the steppes under Genghis Khan and his successors that built the largest land empire in human history, had swept across the Middle East, and in 1243 a Mongol army had crushed the Seljuks of Rum, reducing the once brilliant sultanate to a tribute-paying vassal. And then, as Mongol power itself fragmented, leaving Anatolia a patchwork of fragments, by the time Osman appears on his hillside at the end of the century, the Seljuk Sultanate had dwindled to nothing. Mongol overlordship was fading into chaos, and Anatolia had broken into a mosaic of small independent Turkish principalities, the Beyliks, each ruled by its own bey, its own frontier lord, competing with one another, raiding their Christian neighbours, jostling for advantage in the wreckage of the old order. And along the western edge of this mosaic, where the Turkish Beyliks met what remained of the Byzantine Empire, ran the frontier, the marchland, the war zone, the fluid and violent and opportunity-rich border between the Muslim-Turkish world and the Christian-Greek one. This frontier was a world unto itself, with its own culture and its own ethos. The world of the Ghazi, the frontier warrior, the holy fighter for the faith. Though the reality was always more complex and more interesting than the religious ideal, for the frontier was a place of mixing as much as fighting, where Muslims and Christians traded and intermarried and allied as often as they fought, where renegades crossed in both directions, where a successful frontier lord might have Greek Christians and Turkish Muslims both in his warband, where the lines of religion and loyalty were endlessly blurred and crossed. It was a world of opportunity for the bold and the lucky and the able. A world where a man with a horse and a sword and a gift for leadership could gather followers, win plunder, carve out a lordship, rise from nothing. And it was on this frontier, in this world of breakdown and opportunity, and the endless fluid warfare and mixing of the marchland, that Osman, the obscure bey of an obscure band in the hills near Soget, began to rise. The founder gave his name to everything that followed. Ottoman is the Western form of Osmanli, of Osman, the people of Osman, and every sultan who ever ruled the empire, across more than 6 centuries, was a descendant of this one frontier chieftain, the House of Osman ruling in an unbroken male line from the dusk on the hillside to the 20th century, one of the longest reigning dynasties in the history of the world. And yet, for all his vast importance, Osman himself is a shadowy figure, glimpsed only dimly through the mist of legend and the later chronicles written when his small lordship had already become a great empire and needed a suitably grand founding story. We know that he was real. We know roughly when he lived, around the turn of the 14th century. We know that he led a band of frontier warriors in the hills of northwestern Anatolia, and that he won victories against the local Byzantine forces and expanded his territory. Beyond that, much is legend, but the legend itself is worth knowing, because it tells us how the Ottomans understood their own beginning. The most famous story is the Dream of Osman. According to the tradition, written down much later, but cherished as the foundational myth of the dynasty, the young Osman was a guest in the house of a holy man, a sheikh named Edebali, a Sufi spiritual master whose daughter Osman loved. And one night, sleeping in the sheikh's house, Osman had a dream. He dreamed that he saw a moon rise from the holy man's breast and sink into his own, and from his own breast there grew a great tree, a tree that grew and grew until its branches and its shade covered the whole world, and beneath the tree rose mountains, and from the mountains flowed rivers, and the rivers watered fields and fed great cities, and the whole world flourished beneath the shade of the tree that had grown from Osman's breast. And he awoke and told the dream to the sheikh, and the sheikh interpreted it. The tree was the empire that would grow from Osman and his descendants, the empire that would spread its shade across the world, and the moon that had passed from the sheikh's breast to Osman's was the sheikh's daughter, whom Osman would marry, so that the line of the holy man and the line of the warrior would be joined in the dynasty that would rule the world. And Osman married the sheikh's daughter, and the dream, so the tradition says, began to come true. It is a legend, of course, shaped by hindsight, the empire reading its own grandeur back into its humble beginning, but it captures something real about the Ottoman self-understanding, the fusion of the warrior and the holy man, the sword and the faith, the worldly ambition and the religious mission that the Ottomans saw at the root of their enterprise. Osman was a Ghazi, a frontier warrior for the faith, but he was also a canny and pragmatic frontier lord, and the early Ottoman success rested on a combination of qualities that the dream, in its way, symbolizes. Military boldness and skill, yes, but also a gift for attracting and holding followers, for absorbing rather than merely conquering, for offering opportunity and reward to those who joined the enterprise, whatever their origin. The early Ottoman band grew not only by conquest but by attraction, drawing in other frontier warriors, Turkish and sometimes Christian, ambitious men who saw in Osman's rising fortunes a chance for plunder and land and advancement, so that the warband swelled and the lordship grew, victory feeding on victory, success drawing in the followers who made further success possible. What Osman actually achieved, beneath the legend, was the transformation of his small frontier lordship into the strongest of the local powers along that stretch of the Byzantine frontier. He pressed against the Byzantine territories to his west, raiding and capturing, extending his control over the countryside, hemming in the Byzantine towns. His great strategic achievement was to focus his pressure on the important Byzantine city of Bursa, near the Sea of Marmara, a rich and well-defended city that Osman besieged for years, slowly cutting it off, though he did not live to see it fall. When Osman died, around 1323 or 1324, he left to his son a lordship transformed from the obscure band of his youth into a real and growing principality, poised on the edge of greater things, the small tree of the dream beginning, at last, to grow. And his son Orhan would take that growing lordship and begin to make of it something the frontier had never seen before. Not just a warband, but a state. Osman left a warband and a growing lordship. His son Orhan, who ruled for some 36 years across the middle of the 14th century, began to turn it into a state, and the difference between a warband and a state is the difference between a flash of conquest that fades and an empire that endures. Orhan was the builder of institutions, the organizer, the ruler who took what his father's sword had won and gave it structure, permanence, the machinery of lasting government, and he began, fittingly, by completing his father's great unfinished work, the capture of Bursa, which fell to the Ottomans early in Orhan's reign, around 1326, after its long encirclement. Bursa became the first true Ottoman capital, a real city with a settled court, mosques and markets and schools, and the tombs of the dynasty, the place where the Ottoman enterprise put down its first deep roots and began to take on the character of a permanent state rather than a roving warband. Under Orhan, the Ottomans took the other great Byzantine cities of northwestern Anatolia, Nicaea, the city where the great church councils had been held, the city of the Nicene Creed, fell to the Ottomans and its greatest church became a mosque, and Nicomedia fell too. The whole of the northwestern corner of Anatolia, the rich and populous region nearest to Constantinople, passed under Ottoman control, and the Byzantine Empire, by now a shrunken remnant of its former greatness, racked by civil wars, reduced to little more than its capital and a few scattered territories, found itself with this vigorous, growing Turkish power established on its very doorstep, just across the water from Constantinople itself. Orhan began to mint coins in his own name, the mark of a sovereign ruler. He began to build the institutions of government, the beginnings of an administration, a system of land grants to support his cavalry, the religious and legal institutions of a Muslim state. He married, in a sign of how the Ottomans had risen in the world, a Byzantine princess, Theodora, daughter of the Byzantine Emperor John Cantacuzenus, the marriage sealing an alliance, for the Ottomans had become powerful enough that the Byzantine emperors now sought them as allies in their own endless civil wars, hiring Ottoman troops to fight their Christian rivals, and it was through exactly this door, invited in as allies and mercenaries in Byzantine civil wars, that the Ottomans made the move that would change everything. They crossed into Europe. In the 1350s, Ottoman forces, fighting as allies of one Byzantine faction, crossed the narrow strait of the Dardanelles into the European shore, into Thrace, into the Balkans, and once across they did not leave. They seized the fortress of Gallipoli on the European side, securing a permanent foothold, a bridgehead into Europe, and from that bridgehead they began to expand into the Balkan Peninsula, into the patchwork of Christian states, Byzantine, Bulgarian, Serbian, that filled the lands between the Ottomans and the Danube. It was a fateful crossing. The Ottomans were no longer merely an Anatolian frontier power pressing against the dying Byzantine Empire. They were now established in Europe itself, in the Balkans, with all the rich and populous and divided Christian lands of southeastern Europe lying open before them. The small tree of the dream was spreading its branches across the water into a new continent. This crossing into Europe, and the rapid Ottoman expansion into the Balkans that followed, is one of the keys to the whole Ottoman story, and it is worth pausing on, because it reveals the secret of Ottoman success. The Balkans in the 14th century were divided, a quarrelling patchwork of Christian states and lords, Byzantine and Serbian and Bulgarian, who hated and fought one another as much as they feared the advancing Turks, and who proved utterly unable to unite against the common threat. The Ottomans exploited this division with great skill, playing the Christian powers against one another, allying with one to defeat another, absorbing the Balkans piece by piece through a combination of conquest and diplomacy, and the exploitation of their enemies' disunity. And crucially, the Ottomans offered the conquered peoples something: not annihilation, not forced conversion, but a place in the Ottoman order. The Christian peasantry of the Balkans often found Ottoman rule no harsher, and sometimes lighter, than the rule of their own Christian lords. The Ottomans left them their religion, their churches, their communities, demanding taxes and obedience, but not the abandonment of their faith. Christian lords who submitted were often taken into the Ottoman system, allowed to keep their lands as Ottoman vassals, their sons rising in Ottoman service. This pragmatic tolerance, this capacity to absorb and incorporate rather than merely to crush, was one of the great Ottoman strengths, and it allowed the empire to expand far faster and to hold what it took far more securely than mere conquest ever could have. Orhan's son Murad I, who came to the throne around 1362 and ruled for nearly 3 decades, was the ruler who turned the Ottoman foothold in Europe into Ottoman dominance over the Balkans, and who took the decisive steps that transformed the Ottoman Principality into an empire spanning 2 continents. Under Murad, the Ottoman advance into southeastern Europe became a flood. He took Adrianople, the great Byzantine city in Thrace, which the Ottomans called Edirne, and made it his European capital, a magnificent city that would be the Ottoman seat of government for nearly a century, closer to the heart of the Balkans than Bursa, a base for the continuing expansion into Europe. The choice of Edirne as capital signaled the Ottoman commitment to Europe. This was no longer an Anatolian power that happened to have European territories, but an empire whose center of gravity was shifting decisively into the Balkans, into Europe, toward the great city of Constantinople, that now lay almost surrounded by Ottoman territory on both the European and the Asian shores. Murad pressed the Ottoman advance deep into the Balkans, against the Bulgarians, against the Serbs, against the remaining Byzantine territories, extending Ottoman control over Macedonia, over much of Bulgaria, deep into Serbian lands, reducing one Christian power after another to vassalage or outright conquest. And it was under Murad, or in this formative period, that the Ottomans developed the institutions that would become the hallmarks of their state and the engines of their power. Above all, the 2 linked institutions of the Devshirme and the Janissaries, which we will explore in depth later in the night, but which must be introduced here, because they are central to everything. The Devshirme was the collection, a periodic levy of Christian boys from the Balkan villages, taken from their families, converted to Islam, educated and trained in the service of the Sultan, and formed into the elite of the Ottoman state, the most promising rising through the palace schools to the highest offices of government, even to the Grand Vizierate, the chief ministership of the empire, the rest forming the Janissaries, the Sultan's standing infantry, the first permanent professional standing army in Europe since Roman times, slave soldiers of the Sultan, superbly trained and disciplined, fanatically loyal, armed eventually with gunpowder weapons, the terror of the Ottoman enemies, and the iron core of the Ottoman war machine. This system, the elite of the empire, drawn from converted Christian slaves, the highest offices of state filled by men who had been taken as boys from Balkan villages, strikes the modern mind as strange, even shocking, and it was unlike anything in the contemporary Christian world. But it was, in its way, a system of extraordinary effectiveness, and even, paradoxically, of opportunity. The slave administrators and slave soldiers of the Sultan owed everything to him. They had no independent power base, no noble lineage, no hereditary lands, nothing but their position in his service, and so they could not threaten the dynasty as an independent nobility might, could not build rival power centers, could be relied upon for loyalty in a way that a hereditary aristocracy never could, and for the boys themselves, harsh as the system was torn from their families, converted from their ancestral faith, it offered a path of advancement unimaginable in the rigid hereditary societies of the age. A peasant's son from a Balkan village might rise, through ability and the Sultan's favour, to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in a vast empire, commanding armies, governing provinces, accumulating wealth and honour beyond any dream available to him in the village of his birth. It was a meritocracy of the unfree, a system that channeled the talents of the conquered into the service of the conqueror, and it produced, across the centuries, many of the ablest soldiers and statesmen the empire ever had. Murad's reign ended on one of the most famous battlefields in the history of the Balkans, Kosovo. In 1389, on the field of Kosovo Polje, the field of the Blackbirds, Murad faced a coalition of Serbian and other Balkan forces under the Serbian Prince Lazar, in a battle that has become one of the central, defining, endlessly mythologized events in the national memory of the Serbian people. The battle was hard-fought and bloody, and both leaders died. Prince Lazar captured and killed, and Murad himself slain, according to tradition, by a Serbian noble who gained access to the Sultan's tent and stabbed him, one of the few Ottoman sultans ever to die on the battlefield. The outcome of the battle itself was militarily ambiguous. Both sides were shattered, but its strategic consequences were clear. Serbian power was broken, and the Ottoman advance continued. In Serbian memory, Kosovo became the great tragedy and the great sacred symbol, the heroic last stand, the lost battle that defined a nation's sense of itself across the centuries that followed. In Ottoman history, it was another step in the long advance, the death of one sultan and the accession of the next, the relentless growth of the empire that now dominated the Balkans and stood, more and more clearly, as the great power of southeastern Europe. Murad's son Bayezid, who came to the throne on the field of Kosovo in 1389, was given a name that history has remembered, Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed and violence of his movements, the lightning rapidity with which he struck now in Europe, now in Asia, marching his armies back and forth across his two-continent empire with a swiftness that astonished his contemporary. Bayezid was a warrior of tremendous energy and ambition, and under him the Ottoman expansion reached a new pitch of intensity, and then, suddenly, catastrophically, collapsed. In one of the most dramatic reversals in the empire's history, a disaster so complete that it nearly ended the Ottoman story altogether, just as it was reaching for greatness. Bayezid drove the Ottoman conquests forward on every front. In the Balkans, he completed the subjugation of Bulgaria, pressed against Hungary and Wallachia, extended Ottoman power toward the Danube. He laid siege to Constantinople itself, the first serious Ottoman attempt on the great city, blockading it for years, building a fortress on the Bosphorus to cut it off, bringing the ancient capital to the edge of starvation, a foretaste of the final conquests that would come 2 generations later. And when a great crusade was launched from Europe to drive back the Ottoman advance, a coalition of European knights, French and Hungarian and German and others, marching down the Danube to confront the Thunderbolt, Bayezid met them at Nicopolis in 1396 and destroyed them, a crushing Ottoman victory over the assembled chivalry of Christian Europe that sent a shock through the Western world and confirmed the Ottomans as a power that the whole of Christendom now had to fear. In Anatolia, meanwhile, Bayezid turned on his fellow Turkish beyliks, the other principalities that had emerged alongside the Ottomans from the wreckage of the Seljuk world, conquering and annexing them one after another, uniting most of Anatolia under Ottoman rule, building a unified empire across both continents. But it was this very expansion in Anatolia, the conquest of the other Turkish beyliks, that brought disaster, for it set the Ottomans on a collision course with the most terrifying conqueror of the age, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, the lame Turco-Mongol warlord who had risen in Central Asia to build a vast and brutal empire stretching from India to the edge of Anatolia, a conqueror in the mold of Genghis Khan, whose campaigns left pyramids of skulls in the ruins of the cities that defied him. The beyliks that Bayezid had conquered appealed to Timur. Their dispossessed lords fled to his court and urged him against the Ottomans, and Timur, already the master of an empire that dwarfed Bayezid's, turned his attention westward, toward Anatolia, toward the upstart Ottoman Sultan who had presumed to unite the Turkish lands that Timur considered his own to dispose of. The two great conquerors, the Thunderbolt and the Lame, the two most powerful Muslim rulers of the age, moved toward the confrontation that would decide the fate of Anatolia. They met at Ankara in the summer of 1402, in one of the decisive battles of the age, and Bayezid was utterly defeated. Timur's army was larger, and crucially, many of Bayezid's own troops deserted him on the field. The soldiers of the recently conquered Beyliks, fighting in Bayezid's army, went over to Timur, who represented to them the restoration of their old lords, and Bayezid's host disintegrated. The Thunderbolt was captured, taken prisoner by Timur, the only Ottoman sultan ever to fall into the hands of an enemy, and he died in Timur's captivity the following year, a broken man, according to legend, carried about in a cage or a litter behind the conqueror's army, the most humiliating end any Ottoman sultan ever met. And the empire that Bayezid had built collapsed. Timur dismantled it, restoring the conquered Beyliks, partitioning the Ottoman lands, dividing what remained among Bayezid's sons, and then, his work of destruction done, withdrawing eastward, leaving Anatolia in fragments, and the Ottoman enterprise apparently shattered, reduced once more to the warring fragments from which it had risen. This was the great catastrophe, the moment when the Ottoman story very nearly ended, and the period that followed, the decade or so after Ankara, is known as the Ottoman Interregnum, the time of troubles when the sons of Bayezid fought one another for the fragments of their father's empire in a long and bitter civil war, and it seemed entirely possible that the Ottoman state would simply dissolve, that the great tree of Osman's dream would be cut down before it had ever truly grown, that the Ottomans would become what so many had expected them to be all along, a footnote, a flash of frontier ambition that flared and died, that the empire survived this catastrophe, that it pulled itself back together from total collapse and went on to greater heights than ever, is one of the most remarkable things about Ottoman history, and it is a testament to the depth of the institutions that Orhan and Murad had built, the roots that the dynasty had put down, the loyalty that the Ottoman system commanded even in the depths of disaster. The tree had been cut down almost to the ground, but the roots held, and it grew again. The recovery of the Ottoman Empire, after the catastrophe of Ankara, is a story of patient rebuilding, and it was the work of two able and determined sultans across the first half of the 15th century, Mehmed I, who emerged victorious from the long civil war of the Interregnum and reunited the core of the Ottoman lands, and his son Murad II, who consolidated the recovery and restored the empire to something approaching its former power. Together, across some 4 decades, these two rulers brought the Ottoman state back from the brink of dissolution, knit the fragments together again, reasserted control over the Balkans and Anatolia, and rebuilt the institutions and the armies that Timur had shattered, so that by the middle of the 15th century the empire was once more the dominant power of the region, stronger in some ways than it had ever been, and poised at last for the great achievement that had eluded every Ottoman sultan before, the conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed I won the civil war of the Interregnum through patience, skill, and a good deal of luck, outlasting and defeating his brothers to reunite the Ottoman heartlands by 1413. He spent his reign consolidating, healing the wounds of the civil war, restoring the shaken loyalty of the Ottoman forces and vassals, rebuilding the central authority of the Sultanate. His son Murad II, who came to the throne in 1421, continued and deepened the recovery. But he faced a difficult reign, beset by challenges on every side, pretenders to the throne backed by the empire's enemies, rebellions, and above all the renewed threat of crusade from Christian Europe, where the Ottoman recovery had reawakened the old fear and the old dream of driving the Turks back out of Europe. Murad fought a long series of wars in the Balkans against the Hungarians and their allies, against the brilliant Hungarian general John Hunyadi, against crusading coalitions that more than once put the Ottoman position in Europe under serious threat. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, Murad destroyed a major crusading army, the Hungarian and Polish King Vladislav killed on the field, in a victory that, like Nicopolis before it, confirmed that the European powers could not, by force of arms, dislodge the Ottomans from the Balkans. The Ottoman hold on southeastern Europe was now secure. The recovery from Ankara was complete, and the empire was ready, after a century and a half of growth and one near-fatal catastrophe, for the conquest that would make it, beyond all argument, a world power. Murad II was, by the accounts that survive, a thoughtful and even reluctant ruler, a man who twice tried to abdicate, to retire from the burdens of the throne into a contemplative life of Sufi piety and study, and who was twice called back by the needs of the state, by crisis and crusade, to take up again the labour of empire. There is something appealing in this portrait of the warrior sultan who longed for peace and contemplation, who built mosques and patronized scholars and poets, and would rather have spent his days in the quiet of religious devotion than on the battlefield, but who shouldered the burden of rule because the empire required it. And it was Murad II who raised and trained the son who would surpass them all, who would take the great city, fulfill the long Ottoman dream, and earn forever the title of the conqueror. Mehmed II, one of the most extraordinary rulers in the history of the empire and one of the most consequential figures in the history of the world. To Mehmed and to the conquest of Constantinople, the event that stands at the very center of the Ottoman story, and at the center of our night we now turn. Mehmed II came to the throne for the second time in 1451, at the age of 19. He had briefly been sultan as a boy, when his father Murad II had attempted one of his abdications, only to be set aside when Murad was called back to rule. And from the moment he took power as a young man, he was consumed by a single overriding ambition, an ambition that had haunted the Ottoman sultans for a century, and that Mehmed was determined, above all things, to fulfill: the conquest of Constantinople, the great city on the Bosphorus, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the city that had stood for more than 1,000 years as the bastion of Christian civilization in the East, the city whose walls had turned back army after army across the centuries. Constantinople was the great prize, the unfulfilled dream, the obstacle at the very heart of the Ottoman Empire, for it sat astride the straits between the Ottoman lands in Europe and the Ottoman lands in Asia, a Christian island in the midst of a Muslim empire, a constant affront and a constant strategic problem. To take it would be to remove that obstacle, to join the two halves of the empire, to claim the mantle of the Roman imperial city, to achieve what no Muslim ruler had achieved in 8 centuries of trying. Mehmed meant to take it, and he bent the whole power of his empire and the whole force of his formidable intellect to the task. For Mehmed was no mere warrior. He was one of the most remarkable minds ever to sit on the Ottoman throne, a man of wide learning and restless intelligence, who spoke several languages, who was deeply versed in Islamic learning, but also fascinated by the Greek and Roman past, who collected Western books and had Greek and Italian scholars at his court, who saw himself not merely as a Muslim sultan, but as the heir to the Roman emperors, the inheritor of the imperial tradition of the city he meant to conquer. He studied the history of the previous sieges of Constantinople, learning from every failed attempt. He understood, as few rulers of his age did, the revolutionary potential of the new technology that was about to transform warfare: gunpowder artillery, the great cannon that could batter down the walls that had resisted every previous assault. The age-old defense of Constantinople had been its walls, the massive triple line of the Theodosian walls, built 1,000 years before, that had turned back every besieger for a millennium. Mehmed intended to break those walls with cannon of unprecedented size and power, and he gathered the founders and engineers to cast them, including, famously, a Hungarian master gunsmith named Orhan, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines and, finding them unable to pay, had come instead to the Sultan, who paid him handsomely to cast the monstrous bombards that would breach the ancient walls. In preparation for the siege, Mehmed first cut the city off. He built a great fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait, opposite a fortress his great-grandfather had built on the Asian shore. And with these two fortresses, the Sultan controlled the Bosphorus, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea and the grain and aid that might come from there, throttling the city's lifeline. The fortress he built was called Rumeli Hisari, and it was raised with astonishing speed, the whole power of the Ottoman state thrown into its construction. The message to the doomed city unmistakable. The final reckoning was at hand. Within the walls, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, a brave and tragic figure, ruling over the pitiful remnant of what had once been the mighty Roman Empire, a city and little more. Its population shrunk, its wealth gone, its great spaces half empty and decaying. Prepared to make his stand, he appealed to the West for help, to the Pope, to the Italian states, to all of Christendom. But the help that came was pitifully small. A few hundred Genoese under a brave condottiere named Giovanni Giustiniani, some Venetians, a scattering of others. The great powers of the West, divided, distracted, suspicious of the Orthodox Greeks whom they regarded almost as heretics, sent almost nothing. Constantine would face the whole power of the Ottoman Empire, with a few thousand defenders, Greeks and Italians together, manning walls that stretched for miles, against an army of tens of thousands and the greatest artillery the world had yet seen. It was a hopeless defense, but it would be a heroic one, and it would pass into legend. The siege of Constantinople began in the early spring of 1453, and it lasted some 7 weeks, 7 weeks that ended 1,000 years of history and opened a new age in the story of the world. Mehmed's army surrounded the city by land, and his fleet blockaded it by sea, and his great cannon began their work. The monstrous bombards, the largest of which could hurl a stone ball weighing half a ton, were dragged into position before the land walls and began to batter the ancient Theodosian fortifications, the 1,000-year-old triple walls that had never been breached by any army. Day after day the great guns fired, slowly, ponderously. The largest could be loaded and fired only a few times a day, and sometimes cracked or burst from the strain. But their effect, over the weeks, was devastating, pounding the old walls, opening breaches that the defenders desperately repaired each night, filling the gaps with earth and timber and rubble. A heartbreaking labor of repair against the relentless pounding of the guns, the defenders growing fewer and more exhausted with each passing day, while the besiegers seemed numberless. The defense was heroic and desperate. The Emperor Constantine was everywhere on the walls, encouraging, fighting, sharing the dangers of the humblest soldier. The Genoese commander Giustiniani led the defense of the most threatened section, the place where the cannon had done their worst, with great skill and courage. The defenders, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 men in all, against an Ottoman army many times their number, held the miles of wall, repaired the breaches, beat back assault after assault, and endured, week after week, in a defense that won the admiration even of their enemies. There were dramatic episodes that have echoed through history. The great chain that the Byzantines stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the inlet that protected one flank of the city to keep the Ottoman fleet out, and Mehmed's audacious response, when he could not break the chain, of having his ships dragged overland on greased wooden rollers, up and over the hill behind Galata and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely, appearing impossibly within the protected harbour, and threatening the city's vulnerable sea walls, a feat of engineering and will that stunned the defenders and tightened the noose. There was the agonizing wait for help from the west that never came, the watching of the horizon for the relief fleet that did not appear. There was the slow, grinding attrition of the defense, the dwindling of the defenders, the widening of the breaches, the growing certainty, within the city, of the doom that was approaching. And through it all, over the doomed city, brooded the great dome of Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, the supreme masterpiece of Byzantine architecture, the largest and most magnificent church in the Christian world, built 900 years before by the Emperor Justinian, its vast dome seeming to float on light above the greatest interior space in Christendom, the spiritual heart of the Orthodox world, the place where the emperors had been crowned and the great liturgies had been sung for nearly a millennium. In the last days of the siege, as the end approached, the people of the city gathered in Hagia Sophia for a final great service, a last liturgy, Orthodox and Catholic worshipping together in the face of death, the emperor himself present, the ancient prayers rising one final time into the great dome, the candles burning, the people weeping, the 1,000-year-old Christian city gathered in its greatest church to commend itself to God before the storm broke. It is one of the most poignant scenes in all of history. The last Christian liturgy in Hagia Sophia, the end of an age gathering itself for the final darkness, the prayers ascending into the dome that had heard the prayers of 1,000 years. The final assault came in the small hours of the 29th of May, 1453. Mehmed threw the full weight of his army against the battered walls, wave after wave, the irregulars first to exhaust the defenders, then the regular troops, and finally the Janissaries, the elite soldiers, the iron core of the Ottoman army, surging forward against the broken walls in the darkness before dawn. The defenders, exhausted, outnumbered, fought desperately at the breaches. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, was gravely wounded and carried from the walls, and his departure shook the defence at the critical point. A small gate, the Kirkeporta, was found to have been left open, or was forced, and Ottoman soldiers began to pour through, getting behind the defenders on the walls. The defence, stretched beyond endurance, began to collapse, and the Emperor Constantine, the last of the Romans, seeing that all was lost, is said to have torn off his imperial insignia and thrown himself into the fighting at the breach, dying sword in hand among his soldiers, an emperor falling with his city, his body never certainly identified among the dead. A death that, whatever its exact circumstances, became one of the great legends of the fall, the last Roman emperor dying in the defense of the last Roman city. 1100 years after Augustus, the imperial line that stretched back to the founder of the Roman Empire, ending at last in the rubble of a breached wall on a May morning in 1453. Constantinople fell on the 29th of May, 1453, and with it fell the Byzantine Empire, the last living fragment of the Roman Empire, 11 centuries after the first Roman emperor, one of the great endings in the history of the world, an event that sent a profound shock through Christian Europe, that is sometimes taken to mark the very end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of a new age, and that gave the young Ottoman Sultan, not yet 21 years old, the title by which history would forever know him: Fatih, the Conqueror, Mehmed the Conqueror, the taker of the great city, the fulfiller of the 1,000-year dream. By the custom of war of that age, a city taken by storm was given over to plunder, and Constantinople was sacked in the hours and days after its fall, its remaining treasures seized, its people taken. This was the brutal reality of medieval warfare, Christian and Muslim alike, the fate of any city that fell to assault rather than surrender. But Mehmed's deeper purpose was not destruction, it was transformation. He had not conquered the great city in order to ruin it, he had conquered it in order to possess it, to make it his own, to make it the capital of his empire and the seat of a new imperial greatness. And so, even as the sack ran its course, Mehmed moved to take possession of his prize and to begin its rebirth. He rode in triumph to Hagia Sophia, the great church, the supreme monument of the conquered empire. And he did not destroy it, he converted it. The Church of the Holy Wisdom became a mosque, the Hagia Sophia, the cross replaced by the crescent, the Christian mosaics eventually covered or veiled, minarets raised around the ancient dome, the great building passing from the supreme church of Eastern Christianity to one of the supreme mosques of Islam, but preserved, standing, its vast dome still floating above the greatest interior space in the city, a monument now to the new order as it had been to the old. The conversion of Hagia Sophia was both a religious act and a profound political statement. The new master of the city, claiming the supreme symbol of the old order, transforming it, incorporating it, making the greatest monument of Byzantine Christianity into a monument of Ottoman Islam, while preserving its magnificence as a sign of the continuity of imperial greatness from the old empire to the new. Mehmed saw himself as the heir of the Roman emperors, the new master of the imperial city, the inheritor of Constantinople's imperial destiny, and he meant to make the city great again, greater than it had been in its long decline. For Constantinople, by 1453, was a shadow of its former self, a great city gone to seed, its population shrunk perhaps to 50,000 or fewer, its vast walled space half empty and ruinous, whole districts abandoned and decaying, a magnificent shell with the life gone out of it, the capital of an empire that had withered to almost nothing. Mehmed set out to fill it again, to restore it, to make it a worthy capital for his growing empire. He repopulated it deliberately and systematically, bringing in settlers from across his domains, Muslims, but also Christians and Jews. For Mehmed wanted a great cosmopolitan commercial capital, and he understood that its prosperity depended on its merchants and craftsmen of every faith. He invited back Greeks who had fled. He settled Armenians and Jews, many of the latter refugees from persecution in Christian Europe, who found in the Ottoman city a tolerance and security they had been denied in the West. He resettled Muslims from Anatolia and the Balkans. He rebuilt and he built anew, repairing the walls, restoring the infrastructure, raising new mosques and markets and baths and palaces, beginning the great Topkapi Palace that would be the seat of the sultans for centuries, building the Grand Bazaar that would become one of the great marketplaces of the world. He established the city as the seat of the Orthodox Patriarchate under Ottoman protection, appointing a new Greek patriarch and granting the Orthodox Church a recognized place in his empire, making himself, in effect, the protector of the very Orthodox Christianity whose imperial capital he had conquered, a characteristically Ottoman act of pragmatic incorporation, binding the conquered Greeks into the new order by preserving their church under his authority. Within a generation, Constantinople, Istanbul as it would come to be called, was once more a great and growing city, the thriving cosmopolitan capital of an expanding empire, its population swelling, its commerce reviving, its skyline beginning to fill with the domes and minarets that would make it one of the most beautiful cities on earth. Mehmed the Conqueror reigned for nearly 30 years after the fall of Constantinople, and he used them to transform the Ottoman state from a powerful frontier principality into a true empire, centralized, imperial, conscious of itself as the heir to Rome and the master of a great realm spanning 2 continents. The conquest of the city was not an end, but a beginning. From his new imperial capital, Mehmed drove the Ottoman expansion forward in every direction, and laid down the institutional and ideological foundations of the classical Ottoman Empire that would reach its height under his great-grandson Suleiman. Mehmed's conquests after 1453 were extensive. He completed the absorption of the Balkans, conquering Serbia, much of Bosnia, the Morea in southern Greece where the last Byzantine remnants had survived, extending Ottoman power across the whole peninsula up to the borders of Hungary and the Adriatic. He conquered the Empire of Trebizond, the very last fragment of the Byzantine world, a small Greek empire on the Black Sea coast that outlived Constantinople itself by a few years before Mehmed extinguished it, ending the last flicker of the Byzantine imperial tradition. He warred against Venice, the great Italian maritime republic, in a long struggle for control of the eastern Mediterranean and its trade. He brought the Crimean Khanate, the Tatar successor state on the north shore of the Black Sea, under Ottoman suzerainty, extending Ottoman influence deep into the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, and turning the Black Sea, in time, almost into an Ottoman lake. He even reached toward Italy itself, an Ottoman force, seizing the southern Italian town of Otranto in 1480, sending a shudder through a Christendom that feared the Turk might be about to march on Rome, though Mehmed died the following year, and the Italian adventure was abandoned. Across his long reign, the conqueror more than doubled the territory of the empire, and established it as the unrivaled great power of the eastern Mediterranean world. But Mehmed's deeper achievement was the building of the imperial state. He was a great codifier and organizer, and he issued law codes, kanun, that systematized the administration of the empire, the structure of government, the organization of the provinces, the duties of officials, the rules of the imperial household, even, notoriously, codifying the practice of royal fratricide, the grim Ottoman custom by which a sultan, on his accession, might lawfully execute his brothers to prevent the civil wars over the succession that had nearly destroyed the empire during the Interregnum. It was a brutal institution, the killing of brothers to secure the throne, and it would grow more brutal still under some of Mehmed's successors before it was eventually abandoned. But it reflected a hard logic born of the empire's history, that a disputed succession could tear the empire apart, as the Interregnum had nearly done, and that the death of a few princes was a price worth paying, in the cold calculation of the dynasty, to preserve the unity and survival of the whole. The Ottoman succession had no fixed rule of primogeniture. In principle, any son of the Sultan might succeed, and the result was often a deadly competition among the princes, resolved, too often, in blood. It is one of the darker features of the Ottoman system, and we should not look away from it. The empire that built such magnificence, and ruled with such pragmatic tolerance, also institutionalized the killing of brothers, a reminder that the Ottoman state, like every great state of its age and most ages, was built on power and maintained by ruthlessness as much as by law and justice. Mehmed built his capital. He raised the Topkapi Palace on the point of land above the meeting of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, on the Acropolis of the ancient city, the palace that would be the seat of the sultans and the heart of the empire for nearly 4 centuries. Not a single grand building, but a sprawling complex of courtyards and pavilions and gardens, the residence of the sultan and his household, the seat of the government, the symbolic center of the empire, a place of elaborate ceremony and profound seclusion where the sultan dwelt at the heart of his power. He built the Grand Bazaar, the great covered market that would become one of the largest and most famous marketplaces in the world. He patronized scholars and artists and architects, Muslim and Christian alike, gathering at his court a brilliant and cosmopolitan culture, summoning the Italian painter Gentile Bellini from Venice to paint his portrait, the famous portrait that shows us the conqueror's face, the keen, intelligent eyes, the long nose, the air of formidable and melancholy power. Mehmed died in 1481, not yet 50, on campaign as he had lived, his final objective unknown, perhaps Egypt, perhaps Italy again, leaving behind an empire transformed, an imperial capital reborn, and a state and an ideology that would carry the Ottomans to their golden age. He had taken the great city and made himself the heir of Rome. He had built the foundations of empire. He had earned, beyond any sultan before or after, the simple and tremendous title of the conqueror. The 2 reigns that followed Mehmed the Conqueror carried the empire to new heights and set the stage for its supreme golden age. The first, the reign of Mehmed's son Bayezid II, was a period of consolidation, a quieter reign after the relentless conquests of the conqueror, a time of digesting and organizing the vast gains, of building and patronage, of recovering the empire's strength. Bayezid was a pious and cultured ruler, a builder of mosques and a patron of learning, and one of the most consequential acts of his reign was an act of humanity that also enriched his empire. When the Catholic monarchs of Spain expelled the Jews in 1492, in one of the great crimes of European history, Bayezid welcomed the refugees into the Ottoman Empire, reportedly marveling at the folly of the Spanish king, who impoverished his own realm to enrich the Ottoman one, and the Sephardic Jews who fled the Spanish expulsion settled across the empire, in Istanbul and Salonika and elsewhere, bringing their skills and their learning and their commercial networks, and finding in the Ottoman lands a tolerance and security that Christian Europe had denied them, a vivid example of the Ottoman pragmatic tolerance that made the empire a refuge for those persecuted in the West. But it was Bayezid's son Selim I, Selim the Grim, as the Western histories call him, Yavuz Selim, Selim the Stern, or the Resolute in Turkish, who, in a short and ferocious reign of just 8 years, transformed the empire's character and vastly extended its power, turning the Ottoman gaze eastward and southward and doubling the size of the empire in a few years of relentless campaigning. Selim was a hard and formidable man, a warrior of tremendous energy and ruthlessness, who came to the throne by forcing the abdication of his father and eliminating his rivals, and who then turned the full force of his ambition against the great powers to the east and south of the empire. His first target was the rising power of Safavid Persia, the new Shia dynasty that had taken control of Iran and was challenging the Ottomans for the loyalty of the Muslims of Anatolia, posing both a military and a profound religious threat. For the Safavids championed Shia Islam against the Sunni Islam of the Ottomans, and their appeal among the Turkmen tribes of eastern Anatolia threatened the empire from within. Selim marched against them and crushed the Safavid army at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where Ottoman cannon and Janissary firepower shattered the charge of the Persian cavalry, a victory that checked the Safavid advance, secured eastern Anatolia for the Ottomans, and confirmed the empire as the great Sunni power of the Islamic world. Then Selim turned south, against the Mamluk Sultanate, the powerful state ruled by a self-perpetuating military caste of slave soldiers that had governed Egypt and Syria and the holy cities of Arabia for 2.5 centuries, the state that had turned back the Mongols and destroyed the last Crusaders, the dominant power of the Arab Middle East. In 2 lightning campaigns, in 1516 and 1517, Selim destroyed the Mamluks utterly, defeating their armies in Syria and then in Egypt, where Ottoman firepower again proved decisive against the magnificent but outdated Mamluk cavalry, and annexing the whole of their domains, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, the Hejaz with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. At a stroke, the Ottoman Empire doubled in size and was utterly transformed in character. It now ruled the ancient heartlands of the Arab and Islamic world, Damascus, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Cairo, the great cities of Arab civilization, and, most momentously, it now held the holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, the birthplace of the faith and the destination of the pilgrimage and the guardianship of the holy places and the protection of the annual pilgrimage caravan. The Ottoman Sultan now styled himself the servant of the 2 holy sanctuaries, the protector of Mecca and Medina, and claimed, increasingly, in the centuries that followed, the title and dignity of Caliph, the successor of the Prophet, the leader of the worldwide community of Sunni Islam. The empire had become not merely a great state, but the foremost power of the Muslim world, the protector of the faith and the holy places, the seat of the caliphate, a transformation accomplished in Selim's 8 ferocious years that would shape its identity and its claims for the rest of its history. And so we come to the summit, to the reign that the whole rise of the empire had been building toward, the long and glorious reign of Suleiman, the 10th Ottoman Sultan, who came to the throne in 1520 and ruled for 46 years, the longest reign in Ottoman history, presiding over the empire at the very peak of its power, wealth and splendor, the golden age of Ottoman civilization. To the Western world he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent, and the title was earned, for under him the empire reached its greatest extent and its highest cultural achievement, its armies victorious from Hungary to Persia, its capital adorned with the supreme masterpieces of Ottoman architecture, its court the most magnificent in the world, its power and prestige unrivaled across 3 continents. But to his own people he bore a different and more revealing title, Kanuni, the lawgiver, for his reign was remembered not only for conquest and splendor but for justice, for the great reorganization and codification of the empire's laws, for the ideal of the just ruler under whom the vast and various empire was governed with order and fairness. Suleiman the Magnificent to the west, Suleiman the lawgiver to his own. The two titles together capture the fullness of his greatness: the warrior and the legislator, the conqueror and the just ruler, the sultan under whom the empire was at once most powerful and most ordered, most splendid and most just. Suleiman was, by the accounts of his own age, every inch the great monarch, tall, grave, dignified, a man of deep seriousness and strong will, pious and cultured, a poet himself who wrote verse under a pen name, a patron of the arts on a magnificent scale, a ruler conscious of his dignity as the most powerful monarch of the age. He came to the throne well prepared, having governed provinces as a prince, and he inherited from his father Selim an empire vastly enlarged, enormously wealthy, militarily dominant, and at peace within itself, the perfect inheritance for a great reign. And he used it. From the beginning, Suleiman drove the Ottoman power forward into Europe, taking up again the advance against the Christian states that had slowed under his predecessors, and his conquests in the first part of his reign were spectacular. In 1521 he took Belgrade, the great fortress on the Danube that was the gateway to Hungary and Central Europe, the bastion that had turned back the conqueror himself. With Belgrade in Ottoman hands, the road into the heart of Europe lay open. In 1522 he took Rhodes, the island fortress of the Knights of St. John, the Christian military order whose galleys had preyed on Ottoman shipping in the eastern Mediterranean. After a long and brutal siege, the knights surrendered and were allowed to depart, and the Ottomans secured the eastern Mediterranean. And in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, Suleiman destroyed the Kingdom of Hungary. The Hungarian army shattered in a couple of hours. The young Hungarian King Louis II killed in the rout. The flower of the Hungarian nobility slaughtered. The kingdom that had been the great Christian bulwark of Central Europe broken at a stroke. Mohacs was one of the most decisive battles in European history. It opened Hungary to Ottoman conquest, extinguished the medieval Hungarian kingdom, and brought the Ottoman frontier into the heart of Central Europe, where it would remain for a century and a half. In 1529, Suleiman carried the Ottoman advance to its furthest point. The gates of Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburgs, the great city on the Danube, that was the bastion of Catholic Europe, and the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Ottoman army marched up the Danube and laid siege to Vienna, the high water mark of the Ottoman tide in Europe, the moment when it seemed the Turk might break into the German heartlands and carry the empire to the Rhine. But Vienna held. The siege came late in the campaigning season. The autumn rains had bogged down the Ottoman supply lines and the great siege guns. The city's defenders held the walls against the assaults, and as the weather turned and winter threatened, Suleiman was forced to withdraw, the long retreat back to the Ottoman lands harried by cold and hunger. Vienna had held, and the failure before its walls marked, though no one could have known it at the time, the limit of the Ottoman advance into Europe, the furthest west the empire would ever reach, the point at which the long expansion that had begun on a hillside in Anatolia 2.5 centuries before finally reached its bound. The Ottomans would besiege Vienna again, a century and a half later, and fail again, more decisively. But the dream of breaking into Western Europe died, in a sense, in the autumn rains before Vienna in 1529. The empire had reached its greatest extent in Europe, and the frontier would now, for a long time, hold roughly where Suleiman's armies had drawn it, across Hungary, along the Danube, at the edge of the Habsburg lands, the long border between the Ottoman and the Christian worlds that would define the geopolitics of Central Europe for centuries. If the conquests made Suleiman magnificent, it was the law that made him, in the memory of his own people, great. The title Kanuni, the lawgiver, points to what the Ottomans themselves valued most in his reign. Not merely the victories and the splendor, but the justice, the order, the great work of organizing and codifying the laws under which the vast empire was governed. For an empire is not only conquered, it must be ruled, and the ruling is the harder and the more lasting work. And it was in the ruling, in the administration of justice, the organization of government, the regulation of the complex society of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire spanning 3 continents, that Suleiman's deepest achievement lay. The Ottoman legal system rested on 2 foundations. The first was the Sharia, the holy law of Islam, derived from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, administered by the religious scholars and judges, the ulama, governing the religious and personal and much of the civil life of the Muslim population. The second was the Qanun, the secular law, the law of the Sultan, the body of regulations and decrees issued by the ruler himself to govern matters that the holy law did not address or addressed only in general terms: taxation, land tenure, administration, criminal penalties, the organization of the provinces and the army and the court, the whole vast machinery of imperial government. The relationship between the two, the holy law of God and the secular law of the Sultan, was delicate and important. The Qanun operating within the framework of the Sharia, supplementing it, filling its gaps, regulating the practical business of empire that a religious law revealed centuries before in Arabia could not fully anticipate, and it was Suleiman who brought the Qanun to its fullest development, gathering, systematizing, harmonizing the decrees of his predecessors and his own, producing a coherent body of imperial law that regulated the life of the empire with a thoroughness and an order that earned him his title and that stood, for centuries afterward, as the classic foundation of Ottoman governance. The Ottoman ideal of justice, which Suleiman embodied, was an ancient one, inherited from the Persian and Islamic traditions of kingship. The idea of the circle of justice, the conception that the whole order of the state formed a circle in which each part depended on the others. There could be no state without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without a prosperous and productive subject population, no prosperous population without justice, and no justice without the state and the ruler to provide it. Justice, in this vision, was not merely a moral nicety, but the very foundation of the state's strength and survival. For an oppressed and impoverished peasantry could not pay the taxes that funded the army that defended the state, and so the just treatment of the common people, the protection of the productive subjects from oppression and extortion, was the first duty of the ruler and the indispensable foundation of his power. The Sultan was the guarantor of this justice, the protector of his subjects against the abuses of the powerful, the final court of appeal, the shadow of God on earth, whose sacred duty was to ensure that justice was done throughout his domains. It was an ideal, of course, often honoured in the breach, and the reality of Ottoman government, like that of every government, fell short of the vision. But the ideal mattered, shaped the self-understanding of the state, and under a ruler like Suleiman it was, by the standards of the age, substantially realized. The empire was governed with an order and a fairness, a protection of the common subject, and a regularity of administration that compared favorably with anything in the contemporary world. And that helps to explain the loyalty and the stability that allowed the Ottoman state to endure for so long. This justice extended, remarkably for its age, to the empire's vast non-Muslim population through the system that would later be called the millet, the organization of the empire's religious communities, each under its own religious leadership, governing its own internal affairs according to its own laws and traditions. The Orthodox Christians under their patriarch, the Armenian Christians under theirs, the Jews under their rabbis. Each community was recognized, protected, granted a substantial autonomy over its own religious, communal, and personal affairs, governing its own members in matters of religion and family law, maintaining its own institutions, practicing its own faith, in exchange for loyalty and the payment of taxes. It was not equality as the modern world understands it. The non-Muslims were subordinate, paid special taxes, suffered various restrictions and disabilities, were not the equals of Muslims before the law or in the life of the state, but it was, by the brutal standards of the 16th century world, a system of remarkable tolerance and pragmatism, a system under which Christians and Jews could practice their faiths, maintain their communities, and live in security at a time when Christian Europe was tearing itself apart in religious wars and expelling or massacring its religious minorities, when the Jews expelled from Spain found refuge in the Ottoman lands, when Protestant and Catholic slaughtered one another across Germany and France. The Ottoman Empire was not a tolerant society in the modern liberal sense, but it was a plural society, a multi-religious empire that had found a workable way for different faiths to coexist under a single imperial authority, and that workability was one of the secrets of its strength and its endurance. The golden age of Suleiman found its most enduring monument, not in conquest or law, but in stone, in the supreme flowering of Ottoman architecture that adorned the capital and the cities of the empire with some of the most beautiful buildings ever raised by human hands. And that was the work, above all, of one man, one of the greatest architects in the history of the world, Mimar Sinan, the chief imperial architect, whose mosques and bridges and palaces and public works defined the classical Ottoman style and stand to this day among the supreme achievements of Islamic and of world architecture. Sinan's own life was a perfect emblem of the Ottoman system. He was born a Christian, in Anatolia, and taken in the Devshirme, the levy of Christian boys, trained in the Janissaries, serving as a military engineer on Suleiman's campaigns, building bridges and fortifications and siege works across the empire, and his genius for construction, displayed in the practical engineering of war, raised him at last to the position of chief imperial architect, in which office he served for half a century, designing and overseeing an astonishing body of work. Hundreds of buildings, mosques and schools and hospitals and baths and bridges and aqueducts across the whole empire, a lifetime of creation that transformed the Ottoman-built environment and brought the classical Ottoman style to its perfection. A Christian boy taken in the Devshirme became the greatest architect of the Islamic world and one of the greatest in all of history. The Ottoman system, harsh as it was, channeling the genius of a conquered people's son into the supreme adornment of the empire. The central problem and the central glory of Ottoman architecture was the dome, and the model and the challenge was Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine church that the conqueror had turned into a mosque, with its vast dome floating above its immense interior space, the supreme architectural achievement of the ancient and medieval world. A building that had stood for 1,000 years as the largest enclosed space in the world, and the supreme expression of imperial and religious grandeur. The Ottoman architects were haunted and inspired by Hagia Sophia. To build a great mosque was, in a sense, to enter into a dialogue with it, to answer it, to try to equal or surpass the achievement of the Byzantine masters. And Sinan, across his long career, took up that challenge and met it, evolving the Ottoman mosque into a perfect synthesis. The great central dome, buttressed by half-domes and smaller domes cascading down to the ground, the whole composition rising in a pyramid of swelling curves, the slender pencil-shaped Ottoman minarets soaring at the corners. The interior, a single vast unified space flooded with light from hundreds of windows, serene, harmonious, perfectly proportioned, an architecture of light and space and mathematical harmony that achieved a beauty all its own, distinct from its Byzantine model and in some ways surpassing it. His masterpieces are among the glories of the world. In Istanbul, the Suleymaniye Mosque, the great mosque he built for Suleiman himself, crowning one of the hills of the city, its cascade of domes and its 4 slender minarets dominating the skyline above the Golden Horn, a building of majestic serenity and perfect proportion, the architectural embodiment of the empire at its height, surrounded by the schools and hospital and kitchens and baths of its great religious complex. A whole world of piety and charity and learning gathered around the mosque. And in the city of Edirne, the old European capital, the Selimiye Mosque, built when Sinan was an old man, which he himself considered his masterpiece, his masterwork, the supreme achievement of his life, its single great dome, wider than the dome of Hagia Sophia, rising above an interior of breathtaking unity and light, the whole vast space gathered under the one perfect dome, the 4 tallest minarets in the Ottoman world soaring around it. A building in which the long Ottoman quest to master the dome and to answer Hagia Sophia reached its triumphant conclusion, with the Selimiye, the old Devshirme boy, the Christian-born Janissary engineer become the greatest architect of his age, had created what many consider the most perfect mosque ever built, the summit of Ottoman architecture, the golden age frozen in stone and light, and it stands today, 4.5 centuries later, as serene and as perfect as the day it was finished, a monument to the empire at its height and to the genius of the man who built it. Beyond architecture, the golden age of the Ottomans flowered in a whole world of arts, the refined and exquisite arts of the court and the book and the decorated surface, in which the Ottoman aesthetic achieved a beauty as distinctive and as accomplished as in its great mosques. These were arts shaped by the central principle of Islamic art, the avoidance, in religious contexts, of the representation of living figures, which turned the genius of Muslim artists toward other channels, toward calligraphy, toward geometric and floral ornament, toward the abstract and the decorative, raised to the highest pitch of beauty and meaning. And in these arts the Ottomans excelled, developing styles and achieving masterpieces that stand among the treasures of world art. Calligraphy was the supreme art, as it was throughout the Islamic world, for the written word, and above all the word of God in the Quran, was the holiest thing that could be represented, and the beautiful writing of the sacred text was an act of devotion and the highest of the visual arts. The Ottoman calligraphers brought the art of beautiful writing to extraordinary heights, developing and perfecting the various scripts, the flowing cursive hands and the stately formal ones, creating Qurans and imperial documents and inscriptions of breathtaking beauty. The Arabic letters transformed into compositions of pure visual music, rhythmic and balanced and alive. The imperial monogram of the Sultan, the Tughra, the elaborate stylized calligraphic emblem that authenticated his decrees, a dense and beautiful knot of sweeping lines and verticals, was itself a masterpiece of calligraphic art, unique to each sultan, a thing of great beauty that was also the very signature of imperial authority. The art of the book brought together calligraphy, illumination, and painting in the production of exquisite manuscripts, the Qurans and poetry collections, and histories and treatises that the court commissioned and treasured. Though figural painting was excluded from religious art, it flourished in the secular manuscripts, in the great tradition of the miniature, the small, jewel-like paintings that illustrated the books of the court, depicting the deeds of the sultans, the campaigns and ceremonies and festivals of the empire, the scenes of history and legend, in a distinctive Ottoman style, flat, brilliant, precise, less concerned with the illusion of depth than with clarity and pattern and the vivid recording of the life of the court. The Ottoman miniatures are a precious historical record as well as works of art, showing us the ceremonies and the costumes, the campaigns and the cities, the daily life of the court and the empire, the faces of the sultans and their servants, a window onto the Ottoman world painted by the Ottomans themselves. And there was the art of the tile and the ceramic, the famous Iznik pottery, named for the town of Iznik where it was made, which produced some of the most beautiful ceramics ever created. The Iznik potters developed a brilliant white fritware and a palette of glowing colours, above all a famous tomato red and a series of blues and greens and turquoises, and decorated their tiles and vessels with designs of flowers and arabesques of extraordinary beauty and freshness, tulips and carnations and roses and hyacinths, the flowers of the Ottoman garden, and the sinuous curving arabesques and the cloud bands and the geometric patterns, all rendered in those glowing colours on the brilliant white ground, with a vitality and a beauty that has never been surpassed in the art of ceramics. The Iznik tiles adorned the walls of the great mosques and palaces, turning whole interiors into gardens of glowing colour, covering the walls of the imperial pavilions and the great religious buildings with their flowers and patterns, the supreme decorative art of the Ottoman Golden Age. And the tulip, above all, became the emblematic flower of the Ottoman world, cultivated with passion in the imperial gardens, celebrated in poetry and art, its elegant form rendered endlessly in the tiles and textiles and manuscripts, so beloved that a whole later period of Ottoman history would be named for it, the Tulip era, and it was from the Ottoman lands that the tulip would eventually travel to the Netherlands, there to spark the famous tulip mania, a small and beautiful Ottoman gift to the wider world, the flower of the Sultan's garden becoming an emblem of the Dutch Golden Age. At the heart of the empire stood the palace, and at the heart of the palace stood the Sultan, and the structure of the Ottoman court, the elaborate world of the Topkapi Palace, was not merely the setting of imperial life but the very machinery of imperial power, a carefully ordered world in which everything was arranged to express, to protect, and to exercise the authority of the ruler. To understand the Ottoman Empire at its height, one must understand the palace. For the palace was the state, the household of the Sultan was the government of the empire, and the elaborate ceremonies and hierarchies of the court were the forms through which a vast empire was ruled. The Topkapi Palace, which Mehmed the Conqueror had begun, and which his successors expanded and adorned across the centuries, was unlike the palaces of European monarchs, not a single great building of state apartments, but a sprawling walled complex of courtyards and pavilions and gardens, arranged in a sequence of increasing privacy and sacredness as one moved inward toward the Sultan. The outer court was relatively public, the place where the business of the empire met the world. The second court was the seat of the government, where the imperial council, the divan, met to govern the empire, and where the great ceremonies of state were held. And beyond that lay the inner court, the private world of the Sultan and his household, the most secluded and the most sacred, into which few were ever admitted. The movement inward through the courts was a movement toward the sacred centre of power, and the Sultan dwelt at that centre in a seclusion that grew, over the centuries, ever more profound. For the Ottoman conception of imperial majesty came increasingly to emphasize the remoteness and inaccessibility of the ruler, the Sultan withdrawn into the depths of the palace, hidden from common view, his very invisibility a sign of his exalted status, appearing to his subjects only on rare and ceremonious occasions, ruling through the elaborate machinery of his household and his servants. That machinery was staffed, at its highest levels, by the slave elite of the Sultan's household, the products of the Devshirme and the palace schools, the boys taken from Christian villages and raised in the service of the Sultan, the most talented of whom rose through the rigorous training of the palace to the highest offices of the state. This was the inner service, the Sultan's own household servants, who governed the empire as extensions of his personal authority. At their head stood the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister and deputy, who bore the Sultan's seal and exercised his authority, who presided over the imperial council and directed the government and commanded the armies in the Sultan's name, the second most powerful man in the empire, and often, when the Sultan was weak or uninterested, the true ruler of the state. The Grand Viziers of the classical age were frequently men of the Devshirme, Christian-born slaves risen to the summit of power, and some of them were among the ablest statesmen of their age. Men like the great Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, born a Christian in Bosnia, taken in the Devshirme, risen through the palace service to govern the empire as Grand Vizier for 14 years across 3 reigns, holding the vast structure together with a master's hand at the very height of its power. The whole system rested on a principle that strikes the modern mind as paradoxical, but that was central to the Ottoman conception of the state: that the servants of the Sultan, even the greatest of them, even the Grand Vizier himself, were precisely that: servants, slaves, kul, the personal property and creatures of the Sultan, owing everything to him, holding their power and their lives entirely at his pleasure. The Grand Vizier who governed the empire could be dismissed, exiled, or executed at the Sultan's word, his vast power evaporating in an instant, his accumulated wealth reverting to the imperial treasury. This was, in one sense, a system of terrible insecurity for those who served it. The higher one rose, the further one had to fall, and the history of the Ottoman elite is studded with the sudden falls of the once mighty, the Grand Viziers and Pashas who governed provinces and commanded armies one day and were strangled with a silken cord the next. But it was also, from the perspective of the dynasty, a system of great strength and stability, for it prevented the emergence of an independent, hereditary aristocracy that might rival or constrain the ruler, kept all power flowing from and returning to the Sultan, ensured that the servants of the state remained dependent on and loyal to the dynasty. The Ottoman state had no hereditary nobility in the European sense, no class of lords with their own lands and their own power and their own claims against the crown. It had instead the slave elite of the Sultan's household, powerful but dependent, exalted but disposable, the creatures of the ruler whose greatness was entirely his gift and entirely his to revoke. No part of the Ottoman world has been more misunderstood, more sensationalized, more distorted by Western fantasy than the harem, and it is worth setting aside the fantasy and seeing the reality, because the truth is more interesting and more important than the lurid imaginings, and because the harem was, in fact, a center of real power in the Ottoman state, the domestic heart of the dynasty, and at certain periods, a decisive force in the governance of the empire. The word harem simply means the forbidden or the sacred, the private, protected, family quarters of a household, forbidden to outsiders, the domestic space of the women and children, and the intimate life of the family, a feature of elite households throughout the Islamic world and, in various forms, of many societies. The imperial harem was the private household of the Sultan, not the den of idle sensuality of Western fantasy, but a complex and highly organized institution, a world of hundreds of women with its own elaborate hierarchy, its own rules and ceremonies, its own avenues of power and advancement, the domestic counterpart of the male world of the outer palace. The harem was peopled by the women of the Sultan's household, his mother, his consorts, his daughters, his female relatives, and the many slave women who served them and who formed the pool from which the Sultan's consorts were drawn. Like the male slave elite of the outer palace, the women of the harem were often of slave origin, many of them taken or purchased from the Caucasus and other regions, brought into the palace, educated and trained in its ways, the most favored becoming the consorts of the Sultan and the mothers of princes. And here was the crucial point, the source of the harem's power. The Ottoman succession passed through these women, for the sultans of the classical age did not, as a rule, marry, but had children by their slave consorts, and the mother of a prince who became sultan rose to the most powerful position a woman could hold in the empire, the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, the matriarch of the dynasty, who presided over the harem, and who, through her influence over her son and her control of the domestic heart of the dynasty, could wield very great power indeed. For the harem was not separate from politics, it was deeply entangled with them. The mothers of princes had a powerful interest in the succession, in advancing their own sons. The consorts and the Valide sultans were players in the high politics of the court, forming alliances, influencing appointments, shaping the succession, intervening in the affairs of state through their influence over the sultan and their command of the domestic sphere. And at certain periods, when the sultans were weak or young or uninterested in rule, the women of the harem, and above all the Valide sultans, emerged as among the most powerful figures in the whole empire, a period that later Ottoman historians, not always approvingly, would call the Sultanate of the Women, when, across several reigns in the late 16th and 17th centuries, a series of powerful royal mothers and consorts exercised a decisive influence over the government of the empire, ruling in effect through their sons, holding the state together through the regencies of child sultans, shaping policy and patronage, and the succession from within the harem. These were formidable women, intelligent, capable, ruthless when they needed to be, players of the dangerous game of court politics at the highest level, and their power, exercised from within the supposedly secluded and private world of the harem, was real and consequential, a reminder that the women of the dynasty were not the passive ornaments of Western fantasy, but active and sometimes decisive participants in the life of the empire. The most famous of all the Ottoman royal women belongs to the Golden Age itself, to the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, whose consort Hurrem, known to the West as Roxolana, rose from slave origins to become the most powerful woman in the empire and one of the most remarkable figures of the age. To her, and to the human heart of the Golden Age that her story reveals, we turn now. Among all the women of the Ottoman dynasty, none is more famous than Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, as she is known in the West, the name suggesting her origin among the Ruthenians, the eastern Slavs of what is now Ukraine, from where she was taken as a girl, captured in a slave raid, sold into the imperial harem, and where, against every expectation, she rose to become the beloved consort, and eventually the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful woman in the empire, and one of the most influential figures of the entire age. Her story is extraordinary. A captured Slavic girl, who became the partner of the greatest monarch of the 16th century world, and it broke nearly every convention of the Ottoman court, marking a transformation in the role of the royal women and in the intimate life of the dynasty. Hurrem, the name means the joyful one, or the laughing one, given her in the harem for her cheerful dispositions, entered the harem as one slave girl among many, and won the heart of the sultan so completely that he set aside the customs of generations for her. By tradition, a sultan had children by several consorts, each bearing him no more than a single son. The better to balance the harem and the succession, Suleiman broke this rule for Hurrem, taking her as his sole favourite, having many children by her, and devoting himself to her with a love that the records of the age, including his own tender poetry, written to her under his pen name, make unmistakable. And he did what no sultan had done in generations. He freed her and married her, in a legal marriage, raising the former slave to the status of his lawful wife, an almost unheard-of honour that scandalized and astonished the court and the foreign observers alike. The love between Suleiman and Hurrem was real and deep and lifelong, and it is one of the great love stories of history, recorded in his poetry, in the letters that passed between them when he was away on campaign, in the unprecedented honours he heaped upon her, in the simple fact that the most powerful man in the world bound himself, against all custom, to one woman, the captured Slavic girl who had become the joy of his life. But Hurrem was far more than a beloved wife. She was a political force of the first rank, a player in the high politics of the empire, an influence on the sultan and on the affairs of state, and the founder, in a sense, of the era of powerful royal women that followed. She corresponded with foreign rulers. She undertook great works of public charity, building mosques and schools and hospitals and soup kitchens, leaving her mark on the cities of the empire in stone and in good works. She was deeply involved in the politics of the succession, in the deadly competition among Suleiman's sons for the throne that would follow him. And here the story darkens, as the stories of the Ottoman court so often do. For the question of the succession, in a dynasty that resolved its successions in blood, was a matter of life and death, and Hurrem, like every mother of princes, fought for her own sons against the rival claimants. Suleiman's eldest son, by an earlier consort, was Mustafa, a capable and popular prince, the favourite of the army, the natural heir, and a deadly threat to the sons of Hurrem, for by the brutal logic of the Ottoman succession, were Mustafa to become sultan, the lives of his half-brothers would be forfeit. In the intrigues that followed, intrigues in which Hurrem and her allies were deeply implicated, though the full truth is tangled and disputed, Suleiman was brought to believe that Mustafa was plotting against him, and in 1553 the old sultan had his own eldest son strangled before his eyes, a tragedy that shook the empire, and that has haunted the memory of Suleiman's reign ever since. The great lawgiver, the just ruler, ordering the death of his own most capable son, a victim of the deadly politics of the harem and the succession, and the terrible logic of a system that made brothers and sons into mortal rivals for the throne. It is a dark story, and it should not be softened. The execution of Mustafa, like the institution of royal fratricide of which it was a part, reveals the cruelty woven into the fabric of the Ottoman dynasty. Even at its golden height, the human cost of a system that secured the unity of the empire at the price of the blood of princes. And it reveals, too, the real power of the women of the harem, for good and for ill. Hurrem not as a passive ornament, but as a player in the deadliest game of the court, advancing her own sons through the dangerous channels of palace intrigue. After Suleiman's death, it was indeed a son of Hurrem who succeeded him, Selim II, and the line of all subsequent sultans descended from Hurrem, the captured Slavic slave girl who became the wife of the greatest sultan and the ancestress of all who followed, her blood flowing in the veins of every Ottoman ruler from her own son to the last sultan of all. The joyful one from the Ruthenian village had become the mother of the dynasty. We have spoken several times of the Janissaries and the Devshirme, the slave soldiers and the levy of Christian boys that produced them, and the administrators of the empire, and now we must look at this extraordinary system in full. For it was one of the most distinctive and important institutions of the Ottoman state, the iron core of its military power, and the talent pool of its administration, a system unlike anything in the contemporary world, and one of the great keys to understanding how the empire rose and ruled and endured. The Janissaries. The name comes from the Turkish Yeniçeri, the new troops or new army, were the standing infantry of the Sultan, the first permanent, professional, salaried standing army in Europe since the legions of Rome, established in the formative period of the empire and grown, by the Golden Age, into the most formidable infantry force in the world. They were slave soldiers, the personal troops of the Sultan, recruited through the Devshirme, raised and trained from boyhood in absolute loyalty to the ruler, kept under a strict discipline that included, in the classical period, celibacy and communal barracks life, forbidden to marry or to engage in trade, dedicated entirely to the profession of arms and the service of the Sultan. They were superbly trained and disciplined, and they were among the first troops in the world to make systematic use of gunpowder weapons, the firearms and the field artillery that gave the Ottoman armies their decisive edge over the magnificent but outdated cavalry of their enemies, the edge that shattered the Mamluks and the Safavids and the chivalry of Christian Europe. The Janissaries, drawn up in their disciplined ranks with their firearms and their field guns, anchored by the elite household cavalry, supported by the feudal provincial cavalry and the irregulars, formed a military machine that was, at its height, simply the most effective army in the world, the instrument of the conquests that carried the empire from Hungary to Yemen. The Devshirme, the collection, or gathering, was the system that fed this machine and staffed the administration. Periodically, Ottoman officials would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans and Anatolia and levy a portion of the boys, taking the healthiest, the most promising, the most intelligent, according to careful criteria, removing them from their families and their villages and their faith. The boys were converted to Islam, brought to the capital, and sorted. The most promising were taken into the palace schools, given a rigorous education in the arts of government and war and culture, and groomed for the high administrative and military offices of the state. The rest were trained as Janissaries, the standing infantry of the Sultan. It was, viewed one way, a system of enslavement and forced conversion, a heavy and grievous burden on the Christian populations who lost their sons to it, a tragedy for the families whose boys were taken, never, in most cases, to be seen again, and it would be false to the human reality to present it otherwise. The taking of the children was a real sorrow, a real loss, an exercise of imperial power over the bodies and souls of the conquered, and the Christian communities who endured it experienced it, often, as a grief and an oppression. And yet, this is the paradox that makes the system so fascinating and so important. It was also, for the boys who were taken, a path to power and advancement unlike anything available to them in the rigid hereditary societies of the age, and it created a ruling elite of extraordinary character, a meritocracy of the unfree, in which the highest offices of one of the world's great empires were filled by men who had been taken as boys from peasant villages, raised in the Sultan's service, and advanced according to their talents. A boy taken in the Devshirme might rise, through ability and the Sultan's favour, to become a provincial governor, a general, an admiral, even the Grand Vizier, the chief minister of the empire, the second most powerful man in a realm spanning 3 continents, a height of power and wealth and honour utterly unattainable in the village of his birth, unattainable indeed by almost anyone in the hereditary aristocracies of Christian Europe, where birth determined destiny and a peasant's son remained a peasant. The Ottoman slave elite was, in this sense, more open to talent than any ruling class in the contemporary world. It channeled the abilities of the conquered into the service of the empire, and it produced, across the centuries, a remarkable succession of brilliant soldiers and administrators, men like the architect Sinan and the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, Christian-born slaves who became among the greatest figures of the Ottoman Golden Age. The system was harsh, unjust, a real oppression of the conquered, and it was also a ladder of opportunity and a meritocracy of talent, both things at once, like so much in the Ottoman world, neither simply to be condemned nor simply to be admired, but to be understood in its full and contradictory human reality. The Ottoman Empire is often imagined as a land power, an empire of horsemen and janissaries, of land campaigns and frontier fortresses, and so, in its origins and its heart, it was. But at its height, the Ottoman Empire was also a great sea power, master of the eastern Mediterranean and a contender for the whole inland sea, its fleets and its corsairs carrying Ottoman power across the waters from the coasts of Spain to the shores of the Levant, in a great struggle for the Mediterranean that ran through the whole Golden Age, and that produced some of the most colourful figures and dramatic episodes in the empire's history. The rise of Ottoman sea power owed much to a particular world and a particular kind of man. The corsairs of the Barbary coast, the Muslim sea raiders of North Africa, who preyed on Christian shipping and coasts from their bases in Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, and who, in the early 16th century, attached themselves and their formidable maritime skills to the Ottoman cause. The greatest of them was Hayreddin Barbarossa, Redbeard, a corsair captain of extraordinary ability, who, with his brother, built a power base in North Africa, placed himself and his conquests under Ottoman suzerainty, and rose to become the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, the architect of Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Under Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy became a force to rival the great Christian sea powers, Venice, Genoa, Spain, and the struggle for the Mediterranean was joined in earnest, a long contest of fleets and sieges and raids that ranged across the whole inland sea, from the western basin where the corsairs raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, to the eastern waters where the Ottoman and Venetian fleets contended for the islands and the trade. Barbarossa's masterpiece was the Battle of Preveza, in 1538, where his fleet defeated a great combined Christian armada, Venetian, Genoese, Papal, Spanish, off the western coast of Greece, a victory that confirmed Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean and made the Ottoman fleet the foremost naval power of the inland sea for a generation. Through the middle decades of the 16th century, the Ottomans held the upper hand at sea as on land, their fleets and corsairs dominant in the eastern and central Mediterranean, their power reaching along the North African coast, their raiders striking the shores of Christian Europe, carrying off captives and plunder, the terror of the Christian Mediterranean. The corsair captains became great figures of the empire, their exploits celebrated, their wealth and power immense. The sea raiders of the Barbary coast transformed into admirals and provincial governors of the Ottoman state, extending its power and its terror across the waters. The high tide of Ottoman sea power eventually met its check, as the land power had met its check before Vienna, at the Great Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a combined Christian fleet, assembled by a Holy League of Spain and Venice and the papacy, met and destroyed the main Ottoman fleet off the coast of Greece, in one of the largest naval battles in history, and one of the most celebrated Christian victories over the Ottomans, a battle in which tens of thousands died, and the Ottoman navy was, for the moment, shattered. Lepanto sent a wave of jubilation through Christian Europe, which had long trembled before the Ottoman power. It was celebrated as the salvation of Christendom, the breaking of the Turkish tide at sea, as Vienna had broken it on land. And yet, this is characteristic of the resilience of the empire at its height. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet with astonishing speed, replacing the lost ships within a single year, and the Grand Vizier reportedly observed to the Venetians that in taking Cyprus from them that same year, the Ottomans had cut off an arm, while at Lepanto the Christians had merely shaved the Ottoman beard, which would grow back. The beard did grow back. The Ottomans recovered their naval position in the eastern Mediterranean, but Lepanto marked, nonetheless, a limit, a turning, the end of the seemingly unstoppable Ottoman advance at sea, as Vienna had marked it on land, a sign, though the empire remained immensely powerful for long afterward, that the great age of expansion was reaching its bounds. An empire spanning 3 continents, holding the great cities and the trade routes of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, was an empire of immense wealth and the economic foundations of Ottoman power. The trade, the production, the great commercial cities, the control of the routes along which the goods of 3 continents moved, were as important to its greatness as its armies and its sultans. The Ottoman Empire sat astride some of the great crossroads of world commerce, and it grew rich on the traffic that flowed through its lands, for the Ottomans controlled, at their height, the Eastern Mediterranean and much of the Middle East, the meeting place of the trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa, the routes along which the silk and spices and luxuries of the East flowed toward the markets of Europe, the routes of the caravans and the galleys, the great arteries of medieval and early modern world commerce. The empire taxed and profited from this trade, and its great cities were among the foremost commercial centers of the world. Istanbul, the capital, was a vast emporium, its grand bazaar one of the largest covered markets on earth, a labyrinth of thousands of shops where the goods of the whole world were bought and sold. Its harbors crowded with the shipping of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus, Bursa, Salonika, and a dozen other cities were great centers of trade and production, their markets famous, their merchants wealthy, their workshops turning out the textiles and the wares for which the empire was known. The Ottoman lands produced and traded in silk and cotton and wool, in the famous textiles and carpets, in spices and coffee and dried fruits, in ceramics and metalwork and leather, in grain and olive oil and the produce of 3 continents. The economic life of the empire was organized, in its cities, around the guilds, the corporations of craftsmen and merchants that regulated the trades, set the standards of quality and the prices, controlled entry into the crafts, provided mutual support and a framework of order and morality for economic life. The guilds were deeply woven into the social and religious fabric of the Ottoman city, often associated with the Sufi orders and the religious brotherhoods, governed by an ethic of fair dealing and mutual aid and the proper conduct of the trade, a moral economy in which commerce was embedded in a framework of religious and communal obligation. The state, for its part, was deeply concerned with the provisioning of the cities, above all the capital, for the feeding of Istanbul, the great metropolis of hundreds of thousands of people, was a constant preoccupation of the government, which regulated the grain trade, controlled prices, organized the supply of the essential foodstuffs, in a sustained effort to keep the great city fed and quiet, for a hungry capital was a dangerous capital, and the bread of Istanbul was a matter of state. The Ottoman economic philosophy was not the philosophy of free markets and unlimited accumulation that would later arise in the West. It was an older conception, focused on provisioning, on stability, on the just price and the proper supply, on ensuring that the populace was fed and the trades were orderly and the state was supplied. A moral and political economy in the service of the stability and the justice on which the empire's strength was understood to rest. And the empire was, at its commercial height, a magnet for the merchants of the world and a place of remarkable openness to them. The trading nations of Europe, Venice, Genoa, and later France, England, the Dutch, sought access to the Ottoman markets and the goods of the East that flowed through them, and the Ottomans granted them trading privileges, the capitulations, that allowed foreign merchants to live and trade in the empire under their own laws and consuls, a framework that facilitated the great commerce between the Ottoman world and Europe. The Ottoman cities were cosmopolitan emporia, where merchants of every nation and faith met and traded, Muslim and Christian and Jewish Ottoman subjects, and the European traders and the merchants of Persia and India and beyond. A great commercial civilization that grew rich on the traffic of 3 continents, and that made the Ottoman Empire, at its height, not only a great military power, but one of the great economic powers of the early modern world. At the heart of it all stood the city, Istanbul, Constantinople, the imperial capital, the city that the Ottomans had conquered and made their own, and that they raised, across the centuries of their rule, into one of the largest, richest, and most beautiful cities in the world, the seat of the empire and the meeting place of its peoples, a metropolis that drew to itself the wealth and the talent and the diversity of 3 continents. It has been called the city of the world's desire, and at the height of the Ottoman Golden Age the title was deserved. There were few cities on earth to rival it in size or splendor, or the richness of its life. Istanbul's situation is one of the most magnificent of any city on earth, set on the hills above the meeting of the waters, where the Bosphorus, the strait that divides Europe from Asia, meets the Sea of Marmara and the deep inlet of the Golden Horn. The city spread across its hills above the blue water, its skyline a glory of domes and minarets, the great mosques crowning the heights, the Topkapi Palace on its point above the meeting of the seas. The whole city wrapped around the waters that were its life and its beauty. The Ottomans adorned this magnificent setting with the masterpieces of their architecture. The great imperial mosques rising on the hills, Hagia Sophia and the Suleiman and the others, their cascading domes and slender minarets giving the city the skyline that has made it, for centuries, one of the most beautiful in the world. Across the Golden Horn lay Galata, the old Genoese quarter, home to the European merchants and the foreign communities. Up the Bosphorus lay the villages and gardens and pleasure pavilions of the wealthy, and the whole city teemed with the life of a great metropolis. The markets and the workshops, the mosques and the churches and the synagogues, the baths and the coffee houses and the gardens, the palaces of the great and the crowded quarters of the poor, and it was a city of astonishing diversity, perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world of its age, for the Ottoman capital gathered the peoples of the whole empire and beyond, a great mingling of nations and faiths and tongues, such as few cities have ever held. There were Turks and Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Arabs and Slavs and Albanians and a dozen other peoples. There were Muslims and Orthodox Christians and Armenian Christians and Catholics and Jews. There were the merchants and diplomats of the European nations, the Venetians and the French and the English. There were people from across the vast empire and from the wider world, drawn to the great capital by trade or service or ambition. The different communities lived, for the most part, in their own quarters, under their own religious leaders, in the framework of the millet system, each maintaining its own faith and customs and institutions, the whole forming a mosaic of peoples coexisting under the imperial authority, not in perfect harmony, for there were tensions and frictions and occasional outbreaks of violence, but in a general and remarkable order, a working coexistence of diversity that was one of the wonders of the Ottoman achievement. A great multi-ethnic, multi-religious metropolis held together under the rule of the sultans. To walk through Istanbul, at the height of the Golden Age, was to walk through a microcosm of the empire and of much of the known world. The languages of 3 continents in the markets, the costumes of a dozen peoples in the streets, the call to prayer from the minarets and the bells of the churches and the life of the synagogues, the goods of the whole world in the bazaars, the great city breathing with the gathered life of an empire that spanned 3 continents and embraced a dozen peoples. The Ottoman Empire was, in its self-understanding and its public life, an Islamic state, the foremost Sunni Muslim power of its age, the protector of the holy cities, the seat of the caliphate, the great defender and patron of the faith, and religion permeated its life at every level, from the high theology of the scholars to the popular devotion of the streets and villages, from the formal worship of the great mosques to the ecstatic mysticism of the Sufi brotherhoods. To understand the Ottoman world is to understand the place of faith within it, and the place of faith was central, pervasive, woven through the law, the state, the calendar, the architecture, the rhythm of daily life. At the formal, institutional level stood the ulama, the religious scholars, the learned men of Islam, who interpreted the holy law, staffed the courts and the schools, issued the legal opinions that guided the application of the Sharia, and formed a powerful and prestigious institution within the state. The ulama were educated in the madrasas, the religious colleges, which were the great institutions of Ottoman higher learning, attached to the imperial mosques, where students studied the religious sciences, the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, the law, theology, and the supporting disciplines of Arabic grammar and rhetoric and logic, in a long and rigorous course that produced the judges and the jurists and the scholars who administered the religious and legal life of the empire. At the head of this whole religious legal establishment stood the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the chief religious authority of the empire, whose legal opinions carried the highest weight, who could pronounce on the lawfulness of the acts of the state itself, and whose moral authority was such that even the Sultan sought his sanction for great undertakings, a counterweight, of a kind, to the secular power, the voice of the holy law within the structure of the state. But alongside this formal, scholarly, legalistic Islam ran another current, deeper and more emotional, and in some ways more pervasive. The mysticism of the Sufi orders, the brotherhoods of the mystical path, which sought not merely the correct observance of the law, but the direct experience of the divine, the annihilation of the self in the love of God, the inner journey of the soul toward union with its creator. Sufism permeated Ottoman society at every level, from the court to the village. The Sufi orders, the tarikats, with their lodges and their masters and their disciples, and their distinctive practices of devotion, were woven through the whole fabric of Ottoman life, and their influence was immense. Some orders were respectable and orthodox, closely tied to the establishment. Others were wilder, more ecstatic, more heterodox, on the fringes of orthodoxy or beyond. The most famous, to the outside world, were the Mevlevi, the order founded in the inspiration of the great mystic poet Rumi, in Konya, whose disciples practiced the famous turning dance, the whirling of the dervishes, the spinning meditation in which the dervish, revolving with one hand raised to heaven and one turned toward earth, became a channel between the divine and the earthly, losing himself in the rhythm of the turn and the remembrance of God, one of the most beautiful and famous of all the expressions of Islamic mysticism. The Bektashi order, by contrast, was closely tied to the Janissaries, heterodox and tolerant and absorptive, blending elements from many traditions, the spiritual home of the slave soldiers. Through the Sufi orders, the emotional and mystical and experiential dimension of Islam reached deep into Ottoman society, complementing the formal religion of the scholars with the living devotion of the heart, the love of God, and the longing for the divine that animated the faith of millions. Ottoman learning extended beyond the religious sciences, though it was always centered on them. The empire produced notable work in history, the great tradition of Ottoman chronicle and historical writing that records the deeds of the dynasty and is one of our chief sources for its history. In geography, including the famous map of the Admiral Piri Reis, one of the earliest surviving maps to show the coasts of the New World. In medicine, building on the rich heritage of Islamic medical science, with great hospitals attached to the mosque complexes, providing care according to the advanced medical knowledge of the Islamic tradition. In astronomy, including the building of an observatory in Istanbul in the late 16th century, though it was short-lived. The Ottoman achievement in the sciences did not, in the end, keep pace with the scientific revolution that transformed Europe in the 17th century, a divergence with long and fateful consequences, as the empire that had been the equal or superior of Europe in so many fields gradually fell behind in the sciences and technologies that would reshape the world. But at its height, the Ottoman world was a center of learning and culture that rivaled any in its age, the heir to the great traditions of Islamic civilization, the patron of scholars and poets and scientists, a civilization of the book and the school and the mosque and the lodge, rich in faith and learning and the life of the spirit. An empire is not only sultans and battles and laws, it is also the daily life of its people, the food and the pleasures, the rhythms of ordinary existence, the small things that filled the days and gave them savor. And the Ottoman world had a rich and distinctive culture of daily life, of food and drink and sociability and pleasure, much of which has left its mark on the world, and some of which the whole world now shares, without knowing its Ottoman origin. To spend an hour in the ordinary pleasures of the Ottoman day is to come closer to the texture of the civilization than all the accounts of battles can bring us. Consider coffee. The coffee house, that institution so central to the social life of the modern world, came to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans had taken it, in turn, from the Arab lands they conquered, where coffee drinking had spread from its origins in Yemen and Ethiopia. By the 16th century, the coffee house had become a central institution of Ottoman urban life, a place where men gathered to drink the strong, dark coffee, to talk, to play games, to listen to stories and music, to pass the hours in sociability and leisure, the coffee house becoming one of the great centers of male social life, a place of conversation and news and community, sometimes regarded with suspicion by the authorities, precisely because it was a place where men gathered and talked and exchanged news and opinions, a potential center of dissent and disorder. From the Ottoman lands, coffee and the coffee house spread to Europe, the first European coffee houses opening in the 17th century, often founded by men who had encountered the drink in the Ottoman world. The coffee house becoming, in London and Paris and Vienna, the same kind of center of conversation and commerce and intellectual exchange that it had long been in Istanbul and Cairo. The coffee in your cup, and the cafe where you might drink it, are an Ottoman inheritance, a gift of the empire to the daily life of the world. Consider the bath, the hammam, the Turkish bath, another central institution of Ottoman daily life, and another Ottoman gift to the world. The Ottomans inherited the bathing culture of the Roman and Byzantine and Islamic worlds, and made it their own, building great public baths in their cities, beautiful domed buildings of marble and steam, where the people went to wash and to relax and to socialize. The bath a center of communal life for both men and women in their separate hours, a place of cleanliness and pleasure and sociability, woven deep into the rhythm of Ottoman life, governed by elaborate customs and the rituals of the bath. And consider the Ottoman table, the rich cuisine of the empire, drawing on the produce and the traditions of 3 continents, the foundation of what is still one of the world's great culinary traditions, the kebabs and the rich stews, the stuffed vegetables and the vine leaves, the pastries and the sweets, the yogurt and the eggplant, the rice and the lamb, the whole sophisticated cuisine of the Ottoman court and city that spread its influence across the Balkans and the Middle East and beyond, so that from Greece to the Arab lands, the foods of the former Ottoman world still bear the marks of their common Ottoman heritage. And the sweets above all, the baklava and the rich pastries, and the famous Turkish delight, the confections of the imperial kitchens, the sweetness that was one of the special pleasures of the Ottoman table. And consider the garden. The Ottomans loved gardens, loved flowers, loved the beauty of cultivated nature, with a passion that ran through their whole culture. The gardens of the palaces and the pavilions and the great houses, the flowers cultivated and celebrated, the tulip above all, the emblematic flower of the Ottoman world, bred and prized and rendered endlessly in the art, the pleasure gardens along the Bosphorus, the pavilions set among the trees and the waters, the excursions to the gardens and the meadows in the pleasant seasons, the picnics and the entertainments in the open air. These were among the special delights of Ottoman life, the love of nature and beauty, and the open air that balanced the formality of the court and the bustle of the city. The gardens of the empire where its people sought refreshment and beauty and peace. There is a whole world here, easily lost behind the sultans and the conquests. A world of coffee and conversation, of the bath and the table and the garden, of the daily pleasures and sociabilities of a great and sophisticated civilization. The texture of ordinary life in the Ottoman world, much of which has flowed outward to enrich the daily life of the whole world. The coffee and the gardens and the sweetness, the small enduring gifts of the empire. How was it governed, this vast empire, this realm that stretched, at its height, from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the coasts of Yemen and the deserts of Algeria, embracing dozens of peoples and faiths and languages across 3 continents? The administration of so vast and various a domain was one of the great achievements of the Ottoman state, and the system by which it was done, flexible, pragmatic, adapted to the diversity of the empire, was one of the secrets of its long endurance. The empire was divided into provinces, governed by officials appointed by and answerable to the central government. The great provinces under their governors, the beylerbeyes and later the valis, who represented the sultan's authority, commanded the provincial forces, oversaw the administration and the justice and the taxation of their domains. The provincial administration rested, in the classical period, on a distinctive institution, the Timar system, the system of land grants by which the empire supported its provincial cavalry. The land of the empire, in principle, belonged to the state, to the sultan, and much of it was granted out, not as hereditary property, but as Timars, assignments of the revenue of a piece of land to a cavalryman, the Sipahi, in exchange for his military service, the Sipahi, living off the revenue of his Timar, and bringing himself and his retainers to the sultan's army when called. It was a system something like the feudalism of medieval Europe, but with a crucial difference. The Timar was not hereditary property, not a fief held by right and passed down through a noble family, but a revocable grant, held at the pleasure of the state, dependent on continued service, not creating an independent landed nobility, but a class of cavalrymen dependent on and serving the central power. Through the Timar system, the empire supported a large provincial cavalry without the expense of paying it in cash, and kept the provincial military class dependent on the state rather than independent of it. Another expression of the central Ottoman principle of preventing the emergence of independent power centers that might rival the dynasty. Over this provincial structure presided the central government, in Istanbul, the imperial council, the divan, where the great officers of state, the viziers, met to govern the empire under the presidency of the Grand Vizier, deliberating on the affairs of the realm, dispensing justice, directing the administration, the central node through which the vast machinery of empire was coordinated and controlled. The bureaucracy, the scribes and secretaries and accountants who kept the records and the registers, who administered the taxation and the correspondence and the documentation of the empire, was a substantial and sophisticated institution. For the governance of so vast a domain required an enormous apparatus of paperwork and record-keeping, the registers of population and land and revenue, the correspondence with the provinces, the documentation of the law and the administration, the written memory and machinery of the imperial state. The Ottoman archives that survive from this great bureaucratic enterprise are one of the richest documentary records of any pre-modern state. the paper trail of an empire that governed 3 continents through the patient labor of its scribes, and the system was, above all, pragmatic and various, adapted to the differing conditions and traditions of the empire's diverse regions, governing different provinces in different ways according to their circumstances, incorporating local elites and local institutions where it was useful to do so, leaving substantial autonomy to the religious communities through the millet system and to distant or difficult provinces where direct rule was impractical. The Ottoman Empire was not a centralized, uniform, bureaucratic state in the modern sense, imposing a single system on all its domains. It was a flexible, layered, pragmatic structure, a patchwork of differing arrangements held together under the imperial authority, adapting its rule to the immense diversity of its lands and peoples, governing the Arab provinces differently from the Balkan ones, the core differently from the periphery, the Muslims differently from the Christians and Jews, the whole held together not by uniformity, but by the flexible and pragmatic accommodation of diversity under a common sovereignty. It was this pragmatic flexibility, this capacity to govern diversity without crushing it, this art of accommodation and incorporation that allowed the empire to hold together so vast and various a domain for so many centuries, one of the great achievements of statecraft in the history of the world. Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, an old man, on campaign in Hungary as he had lived his life, dying in his tent during the siege of a fortress, his death concealed by his Grand Vizier until the succession could be secured. The great Sultan passing at the height of the empire's glory after a reign of 46 years that had carried the Ottoman state to its summit of power and splendor. And with his death we reach a kind of hinge in the Ottoman story, the turning from the long age of expansion and ascent toward the long, complex and much debated age that followed. The centuries in which the empire ceased to grow, faced new challenges it struggled to master, and entered upon the slow transformation that would, in the fullness of time, lead to its decline and dissolution. The reign of Suleiman is the natural summit of our story. What follows is the long afternoon and evening of the empire, and we will pass through it more swiftly, for it is a different kind of history, less the drama of rise and conquest, more the slow working of deep changes across the centuries. The traditional picture of what followed Suleiman was one of straightforward decline, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, a long fall from the Golden Age, beginning, in the old accounts, almost immediately after Suleiman's death, with the accession of his son Selim II, called the Sot, a ruler said to be more interested in wine and pleasure than in the cares of state, the first of a line of supposedly weak and incompetent sultans under whom the empire slid into a long decay. This picture, the empire rising to its peak under Suleiman and then declining for 3 centuries until its final fall, was for a long time the standard story, and it is not without some truth. But modern historians have substantially revised it, and rightly, for it is too simple, too linear, too much shaped by hindsight and by the eventual outcome. The empire after Suleiman did not simply decline. It changed. It transformed, adapted, faced new circumstances, had periods of crisis and periods of recovery, of reform and reassertion as well as of difficulty and loss. It remained, for centuries after Suleiman, one of the great powers of the world, a formidable military and political force, a vast and wealthy and sophisticated state. The decline was real in the long run, but it was slow, uneven, complex, interrupted by recoveries and reforms, and it took centuries to unfold, and to compress it all into a simple story of decay from the moment of Suleiman's death is to misunderstand the long and complex later history of one of the world's great empires. What did change, after Suleiman, were the conditions of the empire's existence, in ways that posed deep and growing challenges. The long expansion reached its limits. The empire had grown about as large as it could effectively govern and defend, had reached the bounds set by Vienna in the west, and the Persian frontier in the east, and the deserts in the south, and the conquests that had driven its economy and its politics and its self-understanding for 2.5 centuries slowed and stopped. An empire built on expansion, on the constant acquisition of new lands and revenues and the rewards of conquest, faced deep strains when the expansion ended, strains in its economy, its military system, its politics, all of which had been shaped by the assumption of growth. The military institutions that had made the empire great, the Timur cavalry, the Janissaries, began to lose their edge and their discipline as the conditions that had formed them changed. The Janissaries in particular gradually transforming, over the generations, from the elite slave soldiers of the Golden Age into a more hereditary, more privileged, more politically powerful, and militarily less effective caste, increasingly a force of conservatism and disorder in the capital, rather than the disciplined instrument of the Sultan's will. And the wider world was changing in ways that worked against the empire. Above all, the rise of Europe, the transformation of the European states through the military revolution and the scientific revolution and the economic dynamism and the overseas expansion that would, over the following centuries, shift the balance of power and wealth and knowledge decisively in Europe's favor, leaving the Ottoman Empire, which had been the equal or the superior of Europe at Suleiman's death, gradually falling behind. The centuries after Suleiman were not a simple slide into ruin, but a long and complex age of crisis and adaptation, of decline in some respects and resilience in others, of recurring attempts to reform and restore the empire's strength against the mounting pressures of a changing world. It is a long and intricate history, and we will trace only its broad shape, for the heart of our story lies in the age of rise and glory we have already traversed. But the later centuries deserve their due, for the empire endured, after its golden age, for more than 300 years, and its long afternoon and evening were filled with their own drama and their own significance. There were periods of serious crisis, moments when the empire seemed to teeter, beset by military defeat, by rebellion, by economic strain, by the disorders of the capital and the weakness or instability of the throne. But there were also remarkable recoveries. In the middle of the 17th century, after a period of grave difficulty, a line of able grand viziers from the Köprülü family, a dynasty of ministers, not sultans, took the helm of the state and restored much of its order and strength, reforming the administration, disciplining the military, reasserting the empire's power, leading it to new conquests, demonstrating that the Ottoman state retained deep reserves of resilience and capacity, even after the golden age had passed. Under the Köprülü viziers the empire reached, in some respects, a last great peak of power in the later 17th century, and in 1683 it made its last great bid for expansion into the heart of Europe. A second siege of Vienna, a great Ottoman army once more before the walls of the Habsburg capital, a century and a half after Suleiman, reaching again for the prize that had eluded him. But this second siege of Vienna, in 1683, ended in disaster. The besieging Ottoman army caught and routed before the walls by a relief force of Habsburg and Polish troops, the Polish king Jan Sobieski leading the great cavalry charge that broke the Ottoman lines, a catastrophic defeat that marked, far more decisively than the first siege, the turning of the tide between the Ottomans and Europe. The failure before Vienna in 1683 was followed by a long and disastrous war in which a coalition of European powers drove the Ottomans back, and which ended, in 1699, in the Treaty of Karlowitz, the first great treaty in which the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede large territories to its Christian enemies, surrendering Hungary and other lands to the Habsburgs, a watershed moment that marked, unmistakably, the passing of the military initiative from the Ottomans to Europe. After Karlowitz, the long story of the empire's relationship with Europe became, increasingly, a story of retreat, of territories lost, of wars more often lost than won, of the slow contraction of the once expanding empire under the growing pressure of the European powers, above all the rising power of Russia to the north, which would become, across the following centuries, the empire's most dangerous and persistent enemy, pressing down from the north toward the Black Sea and the Balkans and the Straits, fighting war after war against the Ottomans, driving them back, claiming their territories, championing their Christian subjects. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire entered upon the long age of retreat and attempted reform that would occupy its final centuries, a period in which the empire, increasingly aware that it had fallen behind the dynamic and aggressive powers of Europe in military power and in the underlying sources of strength, made repeated and increasingly serious efforts to reform and modernize itself, to adopt the military techniques and then the institutions and ideas of the Europe that now surpassed it, in a long struggle to arrest its decline and restore its strength. There were great reforming sultans and statesmen who labored to modernize the army, the administration, the law, the schools, to remake the empire on more modern lines, to find some path to renewed strength in a world increasingly dominated by the transformed and dynamic states of Europe. The Janissaries, who had become an obstacle to reform, a privileged and disorderly caste resisting all change, were finally destroyed in 1826 by a reforming sultan who suppressed them by force, clearing the way for the creation of a modern army. A great era of reform, the Tanzimat, in the middle of the 19th century, sought to reorganize the empire on more modern and more equal foundations, to reform its administration and its laws, to grant a new equality to its diverse subjects, to remake the empire as a modern state. These efforts had real effect, and the empire modernized in many ways across its final century, building railways and telegraphs, reforming its schools and its army, transforming its institutions. But the pressures it faced were immense. The relentless expansion of the European powers, the rising tide of nationalism among its diverse peoples, the economic and military superiority of its rivals, and the reforms, however earnest, could not, in the end, reverse the long decline or save the empire from the forces gathering against it. The 19th century was the age of nationalism, and nationalism was, in the end, the solvent that would dissolve the Ottoman Empire, for the empire was a multinational state, a realm of many peoples held together under a single dynasty, exactly the kind of state that the rising force of nationalism, with its principle that each nation should have its own state, was destined to tear apart. Across the 19th century, one after another of the empire's subject peoples, stirred by the new national ideas and often supported by the European powers who found it convenient to weaken the Ottomans, rose in pursuit of independence, and the empire's European territories, the Balkan lands it had ruled for centuries, broke away one by one. The Greeks won their independence in a famous war of the 1820s and 30s, supported by the European powers and by the romantic Philhellenism of a Europe that saw in the Greek struggle the rebirth of ancient Hellas. The Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, the others followed across the century, the Ottoman position in the Balkans crumbling. The empire that had once stood at the gates of Vienna pushed back, decade by decade, toward the straits, its long retreat from Europe unfolding across the 19th century as its subject nations claimed their independence, and the great powers presided over the partition of its territories. The sick man of Europe. The empire came to be called in the diplomacy of the age, the ailing power whose eventual demise the European chancelleries anticipated and schemed over. The great question of what would become of its territories, the Eastern question, hanging over European politics for a century. The end came with the catastrophe of the First World War. The empire, by the early 20th century much reduced but still substantial, still ruling over Anatolia and much of the Arab Middle East, entered the Great European War of 1914 to 1918 on the side of Germany and the Central Powers, a fateful choice that would prove fatal. The Ottomans fought hard through the long war, with moments of success. The famous defense of Gallipoli in 1915, where Ottoman forces, in a campaign that became central to the later national memory of modern Turkey, turned back a great Allied invasion aimed at the Straits and the capital. But the war, in the end, went against the Central Powers, and the Ottoman Empire, defeated alongside its German allies, collapsed in defeat in 1918. The victorious allies occupied its capital and moved to partition its remaining territories, to divide the Arab lands among themselves, and to carve up even the Anatolian heartland. And it seemed, in the aftermath of the war, that the empire was to be dismembered entirely, its very core parcelled out among the victors and their clients. But out of the wreckage of the defeated empire rose a new nation. A Turkish national movement, led by the general Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk, father of the Turks, arose to resist the partition of the Anatolian homeland, fought a war of independence against the occupying powers and their proxies, and succeeded, against great odds, in driving out the invaders and securing the independence of a new Turkish state in Anatolia. And in 1922, the Turkish national movement abolished the Ottoman Sultanate, the institution that had endured for more than 6 centuries, from the dusk on the hillside near Surgut to the aftermath of the First World War, deposing the last sultan, ending the rule of the House of Osman, and the following year proclaiming the Republic of Turkey, a new, modern, secular nation-state, rising on the Anatolian heartland of the old empire, with its capital not at imperial Istanbul, but at Ankara, in the Anatolian interior. The next year, the Caliphate too was abolished, ending the Ottoman claim to the leadership of Sunni Islam. The Ottoman Empire was no more. 6 centuries after Osman, the dynasty that had grown from a frontier warband into one of the greatest empires in history passed from the stage, and a new nation rose in its place, modern Turkey, the heir of the Ottoman heartland, carrying forward into the modern world the long history of the Turkish people in Anatolia. The Ottoman Empire is gone, a century now in its grave, and yet it is everywhere still. In the lands it ruled, in the peoples it shaped, in the cities it built, in the boundaries and the conflicts and the cultures of a great swath of the modern world, from the Balkans through the Middle East to North Africa. Few empires have left so deep and so lasting a mark on so large a part of the earth. and as our long night draws toward its close, it is worth gathering what the Ottomans left behind. The inheritance of 6 centuries, the legacy of the empire that grew from a hillside in Anatolia to rule 3 continents, and that shaped, for good and for ill, the world we live in. It left, first, the map. For the modern Middle East, with all its borders and its states and its conflicts, was shaped in large part by the Ottoman Empire and its dissolution. For 4 centuries the Ottomans ruled the Arab Middle East, and when their empire fell, the borders that were drawn across its former Arab provinces by the victorious European powers, the lines that created Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and the others, often drawn with little regard for the peoples on the ground, created the modern states of the region and sowed many of the conflicts that trouble it still. The long Ottoman rule and the manner of its ending shaped the modern Middle East more than almost any other historical force. And to understand the region today is in large part to understand the Ottoman inheritance and the consequences of the empire's fall. It left the cities and the monuments, the great architecture of the Ottoman centuries that still adorns the lands of the former empire, above all the matchless skyline of Istanbul, the city of domes and minarets that the Ottomans raised into one of the most beautiful cities on earth, where Hagia Sophia and the Suleymaniye and the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Palace still stand as monuments to the empire's grandeur, drawing visitors from all the world to wonder at the achievement of the Ottoman builders. The mosques and bridges and palaces and baths of the Ottoman centuries stand across the Balkans and the Middle East and North Africa, the stone legacy of the empire, the works of Sinan and his fellows enduring as among the supreme achievements of world architecture. It left a cultural inheritance woven deep into the life of a great region, the foods and the customs and the words and the traditions that the long Ottoman centuries spread across the Balkans and the Middle East, the common heritage that still, beneath all the divisions and the conflicts, links the peoples of the former empire, the shared cuisine, the shared words borrowed across the languages, the shared customs and music and ways of life, the deep substratum of common Ottoman culture that underlies the diversity of the modern lands. And it left the memory, the long and complex and contested memory of the empire itself, viewed so differently by the different peoples who experienced it. A golden age of greatness in the Turkish national memory, the foundation of modern Turkey's sense of its past. A long foreign domination in the memory of some of the Balkan and Arab peoples who sought their independence from it. A refuge and a haven in the memory of the Jews who found shelter in it from Christian persecution. A complex and many-sided thing, remembered in as many ways as there were peoples who lived under its rule, its legacy debated and contested and reinterpreted down to our own day. For the Ottoman Empire was, like all great empires, a vast and complex and contradictory thing, a state of conquest and a state of remarkable tolerance, a system of slavery and a ladder of opportunity, a realm of magnificent achievement and of real oppression, a power that brought order and stability to a great part of the world across 6 centuries, and that ruled, like every empire, by force as well as by law, by the sword as well as by justice. To understand it is to hold all of this together, to see it whole and honestly, neither the romance of a golden age nor the condemnation of a tyranny, but the full and contradictory reality of one of the great empires of human history, its grandeur and its cruelty, its tolerance and its oppression, its magnificent civilization and the hard power on which, like all civilizations, it rested. It grew from a band of frontier warriors on the edge of a dying world into the master of 3 continents. It took the great city that had stood for 1,000 years and made it the capital of a new imperial greatness. It built an empire that endured for 6 centuries and shaped the history of half the world. And when at last it fell, it left behind a legacy woven so deep into the lands it ruled that we live, still, in a world it helped to make. We have followed the conquests and the battles, but it is worth pausing, in the quiet of the night, to understand how the Ottoman army actually worked at its height. For the military system of the classical Ottoman Empire was one of the most effective the world had yet seen, and its particular structure and strengths explain much about how the empire rose, and why, for so long, it could not be stopped. The Ottoman army was not a single uniform force, but a combination of several distinct elements, each with its own role, woven together into a war machine of remarkable power and flexibility. At its core stood the standing household troops of the Sultan the Janissaries, the slave infantry we have already met, the disciplined professional foot soldiers, armed with firearms, the steady iron centre of the army, and alongside them the household cavalry, the elite mounted troops of the Sultan's own guard, superbly equipped and trained. These were full-time professional soldiers paid in cash from the imperial treasury, kept under arms year-round, the permanent core of the military power. Around this professional core gathered the provincial cavalry, the Sipahis, the Timur-holding horsemen supported by the land grants we have described, the feudal-style cavalry that formed the largest part of the army in the field, summoned from the provinces for the campaigning season, bringing themselves and their retainers to the muster, the great mass of mounted warriors that gave the Ottoman armies their numbers and their striking power. And beyond these came the irregulars and auxiliaries, the light cavalry of the frontier, fast and ferocious raiders who scouted and screened and ravaged ahead of the main army, the irregular infantry, the troops of the vassal states and allies, the specialists of every kind. What made this army so effective was a combination of factors. There was discipline. The Ottoman army, above all its Janissary corps, was famous for a discipline and order that astonished European observers accustomed to the unruly feudal hosts of their own lands. The Ottoman camp clean and quiet and orderly, the troops obedient and steady, the whole army moving and fighting with a coordination that its enemies could rarely match. There was the early and effective embrace of gunpowder. The Ottomans were among the first to integrate firearms and field artillery systematically into their armies, the Janissary muskets and the Ottoman cannon giving them a decisive technological edge over enemies who relied still on the cavalry charge and the cold steel of an earlier age, an edge that shattered the Mamluks and the Persians and the knights of Europe. There was logistics and organization, the Ottoman state's capacity to feed and supply and move great armies across vast distances, to maintain them in the field through long campaigns, to coordinate the complex machinery of a great military enterprise, a capacity that rested on the sophisticated administration and the deep resources of the empire. And there was, in the Great Age, leadership and morale, the confidence of an army that won, again and again, that carried the prestige of an unbroken record of conquest, that fought for a state at the height of its power and its self-belief. Together these made the Ottoman army, through the classical age, simply the most formidable military force in its world, the instrument that carved the empire out of 3 continents and held it against all comers, the war machine that stood, for centuries, unmatched. It was only as these advantages faded as the European armies caught up and then surpassed the Ottomans in the gunpowder technology and the drill and the organization that the military revolution of early modern Europe produced, as the Janissaries declined from disciplined professionals into a privileged and disorderly caste, as the Timur cavalry lost its edge that the Ottoman military supremacy passed, and with it the empire's capacity to expand and, eventually, even to defend what it had won. The story of the Ottoman decline is, in large part, a military story. The story of how an army that had been the best in the world fell behind, as its enemies transformed themselves, and it did not until the balance of military power that had favored the Ottomans for centuries swung decisively against them. But that lay far in the future, in the long afternoon of the empire. In the Great Age, the Ottoman war machine was the wonder and the terror of its world, and the conquests it won laid the foundation of one of history's greatest empires. We have met the great sultans of the Rise and the Golden Age, Osman and Orhan, Murad and Bayezid, Mehmed the Conqueror, Selim the Grim, Suleiman the Magnificent, but it is worth reflecting, in the quiet of the night, on the institution of the Sultanate itself, on what it meant to be the Ottoman Sultan, on the strange and heavy and isolating grandeur of the position at the apex of the empire, because the Sultanate was a peculiar and demanding role, and its transformation across the centuries tells us much about the empire's history. In the Great Age of the Rise, the sultans were warrior kings, leaders in battle, men who spent their lives on campaign, who led their armies in person, who won the empire by their own energy and skill and courage. Osman and his successors were frontier warriors. Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople by his own genius and will. Selim conquered the East in person. Suleiman led his armies from Belgrade to Vienna across a lifetime of campaigning, dying at last in his tent at the siege of a fortress. The early and classical sultans were active rulers, present and visible, leading the empire from the front, their personal qualities directly shaping the fortunes of the state. The whole system depended, in a sense, on the ability of the sultan. For in an autocracy, where all power flowed from the ruler, the character and competence of the ruler mattered enormously, and the long run of able and energetic sultans through the Rise and the Golden Age was one of the great reasons for the empire's success. A remarkable succession of capable rulers across more than 2 centuries, each building on the work of his predecessors. But the role changed, across the centuries, in ways that had profound consequences. After the Golden Age, the sultans became increasingly secluded figures, withdrawn into the depths of the Topkapi Palace, hidden from the world, no longer leading armies in person, no longer the active warrior kings of the rise, but remote and ceremonious figures at the heart of an elaborate court, their majesty expressed through their very inaccessibility, their power exercised through the machinery of the household and the government, rather than through their personal action on the battlefield and in the council. This seclusion had several roots: the growing elaboration of the imperial ceremony and the conception of majesty, the practical machinery of an empire too vast to be governed from the saddle, the particular dynamics of the palace and the harem, but its effects were significant. The sultans, raised now within the palace, often within the secluded world of the harem, sometimes kept in a kind of confinement before their accession in the system that replaced the old fratricide, the cage, the cafes, in which princes were kept secluded and idle, safe but unprepared until they were needed, were too often poorly equipped for the burdens of rule when those burdens fell upon them, lacking the experience and the hardening that the princes of the earlier age had gained, governing provinces and leading armies. The quality of the sultans became more variable. The active warrior kings of the rise gave way to a more mixed succession, some able, some weak, some scarcely fit to rule, and the autocratic system that depended so heavily on the quality of the ruler suffered accordingly. And yet the institution endured, the House of Osman ruling in an unbroken line for more than 6 centuries, one of the longest dynastic continuities in the history of the world. The Sultanate surviving weak rulers and strong crisis and recovery, decline and reform, holding the empire together through the centuries by the deep legitimacy and the institutional weight that the dynasty had accumulated, the sacred aura of the line of Osman and of the caliphate, the sheer continuity that made the sultan and the dynasty seem a permanent and natural feature of the order of the world, that so vast and various an empire could be held together for so long under a single dynasty, through all the vicissitudes of 6 centuries, is itself one of the great facts of Ottoman history, a testament to the depth of the institutions, the power of the legitimacy, the resilience of the structure that Osman's descendants had built. The tree of the dream that grew so great and stood so long before, at last, it fell. We have spoken of sultans and viziers and admirals and architects, the great figures of the empire, the men whose names the chronicles record. But the empire was made, in the end, of millions of ordinary lives, and it is right, before the night ends, to turn toward them, toward the texture of ordinary existence in the Ottoman world, toward the women and the families and the common people whose lives filled the centuries beneath the level of the great events, and who were, in their numberless multitude, the real substance of the civilization. Most people in the Ottoman world were country people, peasants, farmers, herders, living in the villages of the vast empire, working the land, raising their families, paying their taxes, practicing their faiths, living the immemorial life of the rural world that underlay every pre-modern civilization. The Ottoman peasant, Muslim or Christian, Turk or Greek or Slav or Arab, lived a life governed by the seasons and the soil, by the cycle of planting and harvest, by the demands of the tax collector and the rhythms of the village and the faith. A hard life of labor close to the land, the broad foundation on which the whole edifice of the empire rested, for it was the taxes and the produce of the peasantry that fed the cities and funded the armies and supported the whole structure of the state. The Ottoman system, at its best, with its ideal of justice and its protection of the productive subject, sought to shield this peasantry from oppression, to keep it prosperous enough to sustain the empire. At its worst, in times of disorder and decline, the peasantry suffered the exactions of corrupt officials and rapacious soldiers, and the breakdown of the order that protected it. But always the peasants were there, the great silent majority, working the land across the vast empire, their lives largely unrecorded, the foundation beneath the history. The women of the ordinary Ottoman world lived lives shaped by the customs and the laws of their communities and their faiths, lives centered, for most, on the household and the family, on the raising of children and the management of the home, in the patterns common to most pre-modern societies, but with their own particular Ottoman forms. Their position varied enormously across the empire's diversity, by region, by faith, by class, by town and country. Within the framework of Islamic law, Muslim women had certain rights that surprised European observers, rights to own and inherit property, to conduct business, to bring cases before the courts, rights that the records show them exercising, the court archives full of women buying and selling, lending and borrowing, suing and defending their interests, active economic and legal agents within the limits their society set. Christian and Jewish women lived under the laws and customs of their own communities. The seclusion and veiling that Western observers associated with the Ottoman world were realities for some, especially among the urban elite, but the rural and working women whose labor the household and the farm required lived less secluded lives, working in the fields and the markets and the workshops. Their lives governed more by the demands of survival than by the ideals of seclusion. The reality of women's lives in the Ottoman world was various and complex, far more so than the simple images, whether of harem fantasy or of oppression, that the outside world projected onto it. The lives of millions of women across 6 centuries and 3 continents and a dozen cultures, resisting any single summary, the great unrecorded majority of the female half of the empire. And the family was the heart of it all. The extended family and the household, the basic unit of Ottoman society, as of most societies, within which most lives were lived, the network of kin and marriage and descent that structured the social world, the rhythms of family life, birth and marriage and death, the raising of children, the care of the old, the celebration of the festivals and the passages of life, filled the ordinary existence of the Ottoman world, as they fill all human worlds, beneath the level of the great events, the deep substratum of human life on which the history rests. To remember the ordinary lives, the peasants in their villages, the women in their households, the families across the centuries, the numberless multitude whose names are lost, is to remember that the empire was not only its sultans and its conquests, but a vast living society of human beings going about the business of life, loving and working and worshipping and dying, across 6 centuries and 3 continents, the real and human substance beneath the grand abstraction of the empire. Throughout its history, the Ottoman Empire stood in a complex and consequential relationship with Europe, as enemy and trading partner, as model and threat, as the great power on Europe's doorstep that shaped European history in ways often underappreciated, the looming presence to the southeast that influenced the politics and the imagination and the development of the European world across the centuries. To understand the Ottomans fully is to understand this relationship, for the empire was, in a sense, part of European history as well as Middle Eastern history, woven into the fate of the continent it pressed against for 600 years. For much of their history, the Ottomans were, to Europe, the great fear, the terror of the world, the present terror of the world, as a Western writer called the empire at its height, the mighty power that had taken Constantinople and conquered the Balkans and stood at the gates of Vienna, the seemingly unstoppable force that threatened to overwhelm Christendom itself. The fear of the Turk ran deep in early modern Europe, shaping its politics, its religion, its imagination. The Ottoman threat a constant factor in European affairs, the wars against the Turk a recurring theme, the dread of Ottoman conquest a force in European consciousness. This fear had real consequences. It influenced the religious struggles of the Reformation, for the Ottoman pressure on the Habsburgs in the east sometimes relieved the Protestants in the west. The Sultan, an inadvertent ally of the Reformation, through the distraction his armies provided. It drove the alliances and the conflicts of European diplomacy. It shaped the way Europe understood itself, in part, by contrast with and opposition to the great Muslim empire on its border. But the relationship was never only one of fear and conflict. There was also trade, the great commerce between Europe and the Ottoman world that we have described, the European merchants in the Ottoman cities, the goods flowing in both directions, the economic ties that bound the two worlds together even as their armies clashed. There was diplomacy, the embassies and the negotiations, the alliances that cut across the religious divide, most famously the long alliance between the Ottoman Empire and France, the Catholic kingdom that allied with the Muslim Empire against their common Habsburg enemy, a partnership that scandalized pious opinion, but that served the interests of both, and that endured for centuries, a reminder that the relations of states followed the logic of power as much as of faith. And there was fascination, influence, exchange, the European interest in the Ottoman world, the travelers and the writers who described it, the influence of Ottoman goods and fashions and tastes on Europe, the coffee and the tulips and the textiles and the styles that flowed from the Ottoman world into European life, the complex cultural exchange that accompanied the conflict and the commerce. The Ottoman Empire was Europe's great neighbor and great rival and great other for 6 centuries, and the relationship between them, of fear and trade, war and diplomacy, opposition and exchange, was one of the formative relationships of modern history, shaping both the Ottoman world and the Europe that defined itself in part against it. As the centuries passed and the balance shifted, the relationship transformed. From the age when the Ottomans were the terror of Europe, to the age when Europe became the threat to the Ottomans, the rising and transforming European powers pressing upon the empire that had once pressed upon them, the long Ottoman retreat unfolding against the growing European power. And in the empire's final centuries, Europe became the model as well as the threat, the source of the techniques and the institutions and the ideas that the reforming Ottomans sought to adopt to save their state, the empire looking to the Europe that surpassed it for the secrets of the strength it had lost. The relationship came full circle. The power that had once been Europe's great fear became, in the end, Europe's sick man, its fate debated in the European chancelleries, its territories coveted by the European powers, its reforms modelled on European examples, the long arc of the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, tracing, in a sense, the whole transformation of the early modern and modern world, the shifting balance of power and wealth and knowledge between the Islamic world and the Christian, the rise of the West and the relative decline of the great Muslim empire that had once stood at the gates of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire fell a century ago, but it lives on in memory and inheritance in ways that make it one of the most present of vanished empires, its legacy a living and contested thing across the wide lands it once ruled. As our night draws toward its close, it is worth reflecting on this afterlife, on how the empire is remembered, how its inheritance shapes the present, how the long Ottoman centuries echo still in the world they helped to make. In modern Turkey, the heir to the Ottoman heartland, the memory of the empire is deep and complex and central to the national identity, a source of pride in the greatness of the imperial past, in the conquests and the splendor and the achievements of the Ottoman centuries, in the great sultans and the magnificent monuments and the long dominion over 3 continents. The relationship of modern Turkey to its Ottoman past has shifted across the century of the Republic. The early Republic, in its drive to build a modern secular nation-state, sometimes turning away from the Ottoman and Islamic past, in favor of a new national identity rooted in the Turkish nation and the Anatolian homeland. Later generations returning to embrace the Ottoman heritage with renewed pride and interest. But always the Ottoman past is there, the foundation of the nation's history, the great empire from which modern Turkey emerged, remembered and debated and reinterpreted as nations always remember and debate and reinterpret their pasts. In the Balkans and the Arab lands, the memory is different and often more vexed, for these were the lands the Ottomans ruled as subjects, and the memory of Ottoman rule is bound up with the national histories of the peoples who eventually won their independence from it, viewed through the lens of the national struggles that created the modern states of the region. In much of the Balkans, the Ottoman centuries are remembered, in the national narratives, as an age of foreign domination, the long rule of the Turk over Christian peoples, who eventually rose to reclaim their independence, a memory shaped by the nationalism of the 19th century and the wars of independence, often harsh in its judgment of the Ottoman past. In the Arab world, the long Ottoman rule is remembered variously, as a period of Islamic empire and relative stability for some, as an age of foreign Turkish domination for others, the memory shaped by the Arab nationalism that arose in the empire's final period, and by the complex history of the Arab lands under Ottoman rule. The memory of the empire is, in short, as various as the peoples who lived under it, a golden age to some, a foreign yoke to others, a refuge to others still, contested and reinterpreted across the lands of the former empire, the long Ottoman centuries viewed through a dozen different national lenses, remembered in a dozen different ways, and beneath the contested memories lies the deep inheritance. The ways the Ottoman centuries shaped the lands they ruled, the marks the empire left that endure beneath all the later history, the borders and the states of the modern Middle East, shaped by the empire and its fall, the religious and ethnic mosaic of the Balkans and the Middle East, shaped by the Ottoman centuries of population movement and settlement, and the millet system's preservation of communal identities, the monuments and the cities, the architecture and the art, the foods and the customs and the words woven into the languages, the whole deep substratum of common Ottoman culture beneath the diversity of the modern lands. The Ottoman Empire, like the Roman Empire whose imperial city it took, left an inheritance that outlived it by far, woven so deep into the lands it ruled that the peoples of the former empire, however they remember it, live still within the world it shaped, heirs to the long centuries of the House of Osman, whether they cherish that inheritance or resent it, or simply, mostly, live unaware of how much of their world the vanished empire made. Before we let the empire settle into the close of the night, let us take the long view. Let us stand back from the centuries of detail and see the whole arc of the Ottoman story, from the dusk on the hillside to the fall of the dynasty, and ask what it means, what it shows us, what this great 600-year span of human history has to teach about empires and their rise and fall, and about the long, strange drama of the human past. The Ottoman story is, first, one of the great examples of how much can grow from how little. How a small band of frontier warriors on the edge of a collapsing world, with no special advantages, no obvious destiny, nothing to mark them out from a dozen similar bands, could rise, through a combination of skill and circumstance, and the slow accumulation of advantage, to build one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. There was nothing inevitable about the Ottoman rise. At every stage it might have failed, might have remained a footnote, might have been crushed by Timur, or dissolved in the Interregnum, or stopped at any of 100 points along the way. That it succeeded, that the small tree of the dream grew to shade 3 continents, was the result of no single cause, but of a long concatenation of factors. Able leadership across many generations, sound institutions, military effectiveness, pragmatic tolerance, the capacity to absorb and incorporate, the exploitation of the divisions of their enemies, and a great deal of fortune. The Ottoman rise reminds us that history is open, that the great outcomes grow from small beginnings, that the empires that come to seem permanent and inevitable were once small and precarious, and might easily have never been. It is, second, one of the great examples of the life cycle of empires, the long arc of rise and zenith and decline that so many great empires have traced, the pattern that the Ottoman story displays with unusual clarity and on an unusually long timescale. The empire rose across 2.5 centuries. It reached its zenith under Suleiman. It endured, in its long afternoon and evening, for another 3.5 centuries of gradual decline and attempted renewal before its final fall. The whole span, from Osman to the abolition of the Sultanate, was more than 600 years, a vast stretch of human time, longer than the history of most nations, an empire that rose in the age of the medieval and fell in the age of the aeroplane and the machine gun, that spanned the whole transformation of the world from the Middle Ages to the modern era. To contemplate the Ottoman arc is to contemplate the deep rhythms of history, the rise and fall of the great powers, the way that even the mightiest empires are not permanent but move through their seasons, their spring of conquest and their summer of glory, and their long autumn and winter of decline, until at last they pass, as all things human pass, and leave their inheritance to the world that follows. And it is, third and finally, one of the great examples of the complexity and the contradiction at the heart of every great civilization, the way that grandeur and cruelty, tolerance and oppression, magnificent achievement and hard power are woven together in the fabric of every empire, inseparable, 2 faces of the same thing. The Ottoman Empire built the Suleymaniye and institutionalized the killing of brothers. It sheltered the Jews expelled from Spain and took the Christian boys of the Balkans in the Devshirme. It ruled with a pragmatic tolerance remarkable for its age, and conquered with a hard ruthlessness equally of its age. It was a civilization of great beauty and learning, and a structure of power maintained, like all such structures, by force. To see it honestly is to hold all of this together, to resist both the romance that would make it only a golden age and the condemnation that would make it only a tyranny. To see it as it was, a great empire, a human thing, magnificent and flawed, tolerant and cruel, one of the supreme achievements of human civilization, and a structure of power and domination, like every empire that ever was, the full and contradictory and deeply human reality of one of the greatest states in the history of the world. An empire lives in its language as much as in its laws and its armies, and the Ottoman world had a rich and distinctive literary culture, a sophisticated tradition of poetry and prose that flourished at the court and among the educated classes, and that gave voice to the inner life of the civilization, its loves and its longings, its faith and its melancholy, its delight in beauty and its meditation on the passing of all things. To listen to the Ottoman poets is to hear the soul of the empire speaking, in accents very different from those of its chronicles and its conquests, and it would be a poorer portrait of the Ottoman world that left them out. The language of the Ottoman elite was itself a kind of work of art. Ottoman Turkish, a rich and elaborate literary language that drew the Turkish foundation together with a vast inflow of Persian and Arabic, the 3 tongues of the Islamic civilization woven into a single sophisticated medium, the Turkish grammar carrying a vocabulary and an imagery and a whole literary apparatus borrowed from the prestigious traditions of Persian poetry and Arabic learning. It was a language of great expressive richness and great difficulty, the polished instrument of a refined court culture, distinct from the plainer Turkish of the common people, a literary tongue in which the educated Ottoman could move among the inherited treasures of three literary traditions. In this language the Ottoman poets wrote, and their poetry, above all the divan poetry, the classical court poetry modelled on the great Persian tradition, was the supreme literary art of the empire, cultivated with passion by sultans and statesmen and scholars, a poetry of love and wine and mysticism and praise, intricate and elusive and musical, governed by elaborate conventions and rich in its imagery of the rose and the nightingale, the beloved and the lover, the cup and the wine, the moth and the candle, the whole symbolic vocabulary of the Persianate poetic tradition that the Ottomans inherited and made their own. Much of this poetry moved on two levels at once, the worldly and the mystical, the love poetry of the beloved and the wine doubling as the mystical poetry of the soul's love for God and the intoxication of the divine, for the conventions of the divan poetry, with its beloved and its wine and its longing, lent themselves perfectly to the mystical interpretation, the earthly love standing for the heavenly, the wine of the tavern for the ecstasy of the divine, so that a single poem might be read as a love song or as a mystical meditation, the two meanings shimmering together in the same words. This fusion of the sensual and the spiritual, the worldly and the mystical, runs through the whole tradition, and it reflects the deep presence of Sufi mysticism in the Ottoman world, the way the love of God and the longing for the divine permeated even the secular poetry of the court. The sultans themselves were poets. Suleiman the Magnificent wrote verse under a pen name, and so did many of the rulers, the writing of poetry an accomplishment expected of the cultivated Ottoman gentleman. The court, a place where poetry was composed and recited and prized, where a gifted poet might win the favour and the patronage of the great. Beyond the high tradition of the divan poetry ran other currents, the folk poetry of the common people, and the wandering minstrels, plainer and more direct, sung to the accompaniment of the stringed saz, the poetry of the villages and the roads and the Sufi lodges, with its own beauty and its own deep roots in the life of the people, the religious poetry and hymns of the Sufi orders, the storytelling tradition, the tales and romances and the shadow puppet theatre, the famous caragos, the comic shadow plays that delighted the audiences of the coffee houses and the festivals. The Ottoman world was rich in words, in poetry high and low, in story and song, in the elaborate art of the court and the living traditions of the people. A civilization that loved language and cultivated it, that found in poetry one of its highest pleasures and deepest expressions, and that left, in its literature, a precious record of its inner life, the loves and longings and meditations of the Ottoman soul across the centuries. The Ottoman Empire understood, as all great states have understood, the power of spectacle, the way that ceremony and pageantry and the great public display of magnificence could express and reinforce the majesty of the dynasty, bind the people to the state through shared celebration, and impress upon all who witnessed it the grandeur and the permanence and the sacred authority of the imperial order. And so the Ottoman world was rich in ceremony, in the great ritual occasions that punctuated the rhythm of the imperial year and the life of the dynasty, the splendid pageantry through which the empire displayed itself and to the world. There were the great religious festivals of the Islamic year, the two great feasts, the celebration at the end of the fasting month of Ramadan and the Feast of the Sacrifice, marked with public prayer and feasting and rejoicing across the empire, the Sultan processing in state to the mosque, the whole society pausing to observe the sacred occasions of the faith. There were the ceremonies of the dynasty, the accession of a new sultan, marked with elaborate ritual, the girding of the sword in place of a coronation, the new ruler taking up the symbols and the authority of his office in a solemn pageantry of succession, the great celebrations of dynastic events, the births and the circumcisions of the princes, which were marked with public festivals of extraordinary lavishness and length. The circumcision festivals of the imperial princes, in particular, became occasions of spectacular public celebration, festivals that might last for weeks, filling the capital with processions and entertainments and feasting and displays, the guilds of the city parading their crafts, the performers and the musicians and the acrobats entertaining the crowds, the whole city given over to a great public rejoicing in honor of the dynasty, a pageantry of empire that bound the people to the ruling house through shared festivity and display. The daily ceremony of the court, too, was elaborate and meaningful. The ordered ritual of the palace, the ceremonies of the imperial council, the audiences and the processions, the silent and disciplined splendor of the Topkapi, where everything was arranged to express the majesty of the Sultan and the order of the empire. Foreign ambassadors received at the Ottoman court were deliberately overawed by the spectacle. The ranks of silent, disciplined servants, the display of wealth and order, the elaborate protocol, the distant and ceremonious figure of the Sultan, the whole carefully orchestrated to impress upon the foreign visitor the power and the grandeur and the alien majesty of the Ottoman state. The ceremony was not mere ornament, it was an instrument of rule, a language of power, a means by which the empire expressed and reinforced its authority, awed its subjects and its enemies, and bound the diverse peoples of its vast domain to the sacred center of the dynasty through the shared experience of magnificence and celebration. And there were the processions of war and victory, the great ceremonial departures of the army on campaign, the Sultan riding forth at the head of his host in a pageantry of military splendor, the celebrations of victory, the triumphant returns, the display of the spoils and the captives and the trophies of conquest. The military pageantry of the Ottomans was famous. Above all, the Janissary bands, the meta, the military music of the empire, with its drums and its cymbals and its shrill pipes, the thunderous martial music that accompanied the Ottoman armies, and that so impressed the Europeans who heard it, that it influenced the development of Western military music, and even of European classical music. The Ottoman martial sound echoing, transformed, in the Turkish marches and rhythms that European composers wrote in imitation of it. The pageantry of empire, in war and peace, in religion and dynasty, filled the Ottoman world with spectacle and ceremony, the great public language of magnificence through which the empire displayed its grandeur, celebrated its faith and its dynasty, and bound its peoples to the sacred and splendid center of the imperial order. It is worth, before the night closes, setting the Ottoman Empire in the wider frame of its age, for it did not exist alone, but as one of the great powers of a world that was, in the centuries of the Ottoman Golden Age, entering upon one of the great transformations of human history, the dawn of the modern age, the knitting together of the whole globe into a single connected world. The Ottoman Empire was a central player in this drama, and to see it in its world is to understand both its greatness and the forces that would, in the long run, work against it. The age of the Ottoman zenith, the 15th and 16th centuries, was the age when the great Muslim empires stood at the height of their power across the breadth of the Islamic world. The Ottomans in the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, the Safavids in Persia, their great rivals, the Shia Empire against which the Ottomans fought their long eastern wars, and, further east, the Mughals in India, the magnificent Muslim empire that ruled the subcontinent and built the Taj Mahal. These three great Muslim empires, the gunpowder empires as historians have called them, dominated a vast swath of the world from the Balkans to Bengal, a great age of Islamic imperial power and cultural splendor, of which the Ottoman Empire was the westernmost, and, in its confrontation with Europe, in many ways the most consequential. To the Ottomans, the Safavids were the great rival and enemy, the wars between them a constant of the age, but together, these Muslim empires represented one of the great concentrations of power and wealth and civilization in the world of the 16th century, a world in which the Islamic empires were the equals or the superiors of anything in Christian Europe. But this same age saw the beginning of the transformation that would, over the following centuries, shift the balance decisively. For it was in exactly these years that Europe began its great expansion across the oceans, the voyages of discovery that opened the sea routes to the Americas and around Africa, to the Indies, the beginning of the European overseas empires, the knitting of the globe into a single connected world dominated, increasingly, by the seafaring powers of Atlantic Europe. The opening of the ocean routes had profound consequences for the Ottoman world, for it began, slowly, to bypass the old land routes of Middle Eastern trade on which Ottoman prosperity partly rested, the spice trade and the Eastern commerce shifting, over time, to the new ocean routes controlled by the Europeans, draining away some of the commercial lifeblood of the empire. And the wealth of the Americas, the silver and the gold that flowed into Europe from the New World, and the dynamism of the expanding European economies, and the scientific and military and economic transformations that Europe underwent in the following centuries, all of these worked, in the long run, to shift the balance of power and wealth from the old centers of the Mediterranean and the Middle East toward the new Atlantic powers, leaving the great land empires of the Islamic world, the Ottomans among them, gradually falling behind the transformed and dynamic Europe. In the Great Age, none of this was yet apparent. At the height of Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire was among the most powerful and sophisticated states in the world, the equal or superior of any European power, the master of 3 continents, the terror of Christendom, a civilization at its zenith with no sense of any decline to come. But the forces that would eventually work against it were already stirring, in the voyages of the European explorers and the dawn of the New World economy and the first stirrings of the transformations that would make modern Europe. The Ottoman Empire stood at a great hinge of history, the last age of the Old World, in which the great land empires of Eurasia were the dominant powers, and the Mediterranean and the Middle East were near the center of things, and the dawn of the New World, in which the oceans would become the highways of power, and the Atlantic powers would rise to dominate the globe. The empire was a giant of the old order, at the very moment when the new order was being born, and its long later history would be, in large part, the story of a great power of the old world struggling to adapt to the new world that was rising around it, the new world of oceans and science and industry and the transformed power of the West. To see the Ottoman Empire in its world is to see it at this great turning, magnificent in the fullness of the old order, facing, though it did not yet know it, the dawn of the age that would eventually surpass it, one of the last and greatest of the empires of the old world, standing at the threshold of the modern age. Among the achievements of the Ottoman Golden Age, and among the most poignant when set against what came after, was the empire's place in the long tradition of Islamic science and learning, for the Ottomans were the heirs of one of the great scientific civilizations in the history of the world, the brilliant Islamic science of the medieval centuries that had preserved and extended the learning of the ancient world and stood, for centuries, at the forefront of human knowledge, and at their height the Ottomans carried that tradition forward in medicine and geography and astronomy and the practical sciences, before the great divergence of the later centuries left them, like the rest of the Islamic world, falling behind the scientific revolution that transformed Europe. In medicine, the Ottomans inherited and practiced the advanced medical tradition of the Islamic world, itself built on the foundations of Greek medicine, and extended by the great physicians of the classical age of Islam. The hospitals of the empire, the great medical institutions attached to the mosque complexes, the Darushifa, where the sick were treated according to the best medical knowledge of the age, were notable institutions, providing care, training physicians, embodying the charitable ideal of healing the sick that was woven into the religious foundations of the empire. The Ottoman hospitals treated patients of all faiths, applied the sophisticated medical theory of the Islamic tradition, and included, remarkably, provision for the care of the mentally ill, with some of the great hospitals famous for the gentleness of their treatment of those afflicted in mind, the use of music and the soothing sound of running water as therapies, a humane approach to mental suffering that compared favorably with anything in the contemporary world. The Ottoman medical tradition was a real and living thing, the inheritance of centuries of Islamic medical learning, applied in the hospitals and the practice of the empire. In geography and navigation, the Ottoman achievement produced one of the most famous documents of the age, the map of the Admiral Piri Reis, drawn in the early 16th century, one of the oldest surviving maps to depict the coasts of the newly discovered Americas, a remarkable work of cartography, drawing together the knowledge of many sources, including, by the Admiral's own account, charts derived from the European voyages of discovery. Piri Reis was a great Ottoman seaman and geographer, the author of a famous book of navigation describing the coasts and harbours and dangers of the Mediterranean in rich detail, the embodiment of the Ottoman maritime knowledge at its height. His map, with its depiction of the Atlantic coasts and its careful detail, stands as a monument to the Ottoman engagement with the geographical knowledge of the age, the empire's awareness of the great discoveries that were opening the wider world, its participation in the expanding geographical knowledge of the 16th century. In astronomy, the Ottomans built upon the rich tradition of Islamic astronomy, which had been among the most advanced in the world, and the late 16th century saw the building of an observatory in Istanbul, equipped with fine instruments, where a noted astronomer pursued the observation of the heavens. Though the observatory was short-lived, demolished after only a few years, a casualty of the religious and political controversies of the time, an episode that has sometimes been taken, perhaps too neatly, as emblematic of the difficulties that would beset the pursuit of the new science in the Ottoman world. For here we touch upon the great and painful question of the later Ottoman history, the question of why the empire, and the Islamic world more broadly, which had been the equal or the superior of Europe in science and learning for so many centuries, gradually fell behind as Europe underwent the scientific revolution and the great transformation of knowledge that ushered in the modern age. It is a vast and complex and much debated question, with no simple answer, and we will not resolve it in the quiet of the night. But it stands as one of the great turning points of history, the divergence between a Europe transforming itself through the new science and an Islamic world that, for many reasons, did not undergo the same transformation, a divergence whose consequences would shape the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Europe through the empire's long later history. At its height, though, the Ottoman world was an heir and a bearer of the great tradition of Islamic science and learning. In its hospitals and its maps and its observatory, in its physicians and its geographers and its astronomers, a civilization of knowledge as well as of conquest, carrying forward, in its golden age, the long and luminous tradition of Islamic science before the great divergence of the centuries to come. Before we return, at the very last, to the frontier where we began, let us linger a while in that frontier world itself, the world of the marchlands and the borders, the fluid and restless edges of the empire, the world of the wanderers and the holy men and the warriors of the frontier, for it was from this world that the Ottomans came, and something of its spirit ran through the whole of their history, beneath the grandeur of the palace and the order of the law. The frontier, the UC, the marchland, the border region where the empire met its neighbours and its enemies, was a world apart, with its own character and its own ethos, throughout Ottoman history. In the early days it was the cradle of the empire, the Ghazi world of the frontier warriors from which Osman and his band emerged, the restless, violent, opportunity-rich borderland, where a man with a horse and a sword and a gift for leadership could rise from nothing, where the lines between Muslim and Christian, between settled and nomadic, between raider and ruler, were endlessly crossed and blurred, where the empire was born from the fluid mixing and fighting of the marchland, and even after the empire grew great and settled and ordered, the frontier remained, the long borders with the Habsburgs in the west, and the Safavids in the east, and the steppes in the north, the war zones and the marchlands where the empire's power met its limits, where the frontier warriors and the raiders and the border lords lived their hard and restless lives, where the rhythms of raid and counter-raid, of the seasonal campaign and the border skirmish, continued across the centuries. This frontier world had its own heroes and its own culture, the warrior saints and the holy men, the dervishes who wandered the marchlands, spreading the faith and blessing the warriors, the frontier lords with their warbands, the whole restless, mobile world of the borders that stood in such contrast to the settled grandeur of the imperial centre. The dervishes, in particular, played a great role in this frontier world, the wandering holy men of the heterodox Sufi orders, who moved through the marchlands and the newly conquered lands, who settled in the frontier regions and built their lodges and gathered their followers, who carried the faith into the borderlands and helped to bind the conquered populations and the frontier warriors into the religious world of the empire, who blended the formal Islam of the scholars with the older beliefs and practices of the Turkish and local traditions into the living popular faith of the frontier and the countryside. These wandering holy men, with their charisma and their miracles and their tombs that became places of pilgrimage, were among the great agents of the spread of Islam and of Ottoman power through the frontier regions, the spiritual counterpart of the frontier warriors, the holy men of the marchland whose lodges and shrines dotted the borderlands of the empire. And there was always, in the Ottoman world, beneath the settled grandeur, this memory and this presence of the frontier and the wandering life, the nomadic heritage of the Turkish peoples, who had come, after all, as nomads out of the steppes of Central Asia, and who never entirely lost, even at the height of their settled imperial greatness, the memory and the trace of that older mobile life of the tent and the herd and the open road. The nomads and the semi-nomads remained a real presence in the empire, the herding peoples of the highlands and the marchlands, moving with their flocks between the summer and the winter pastures, living the old mobile life on the margins of the settled world, a living link to the nomadic origins of the Turkish peoples and the frontier world from which the empire had sprung. The Ottoman Empire was a great settled civilization, an empire of cities and palaces and law and architecture, but it was born on the frontier, from the world of the wanderers and the warriors and the holy men of the marchland, and something of that frontier spirit, restless and mobile and open, ran beneath its settled grandeur to the end, the memory of the dusk on the hillside and the fires of the frontier never wholly fading from the soul of the empire that had risen from them. And now our long journey through the centuries draws toward its close, and it is time to let the empire settle, at last, into the quiet of the night. We began on a frontier at dusk, on a hillside in Anatolia, in the last years of the 13th century, with the cooking fires being lit and the sheep coming down off the high pasture, and the first stars appearing over the small obscure beginning of the thing that would become an empire. And we have followed the whole long arc of it, across more than 600 years, the dream of Osman and the building of the state, the crossing into Europe and the conquest of the Balkans, the catastrophe of Timur and the recovery, the rise of Mehmed and the taking of the great city, the conquests of Selim and the golden age of Suleiman, the law and the architecture and the art and the faith, the palace and the harem and the slave elite, the sea and the trade and the great cosmopolitan capital, the long afternoon and evening of the empire and its final passing, and the deep inheritance it left to the world. We have travelled from the dusk on the hillside to the abolition of the Sultanate, across the whole vast span of one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. And now, as the journey ends, let the whole of it settle into stillness in your mind. The great panorama of the centuries growing quiet, the conquests and the sultans and the cities fading gently into the dark, the way a great landscape fades as the last light leaves it and the stars come out. Let Istanbul appear one last time in the eye of your mind, the city of the world's desire, set on its hills above the meeting of the waters, the great domes and the slender minarets dark against the deep blue of the evening sky, the Bosphorus shining faintly below, the lights of the city coming on one by one, the great mosques that Sinan built, standing serene above the water as they have stood for 500 years and stand still tonight. Let the whole empire settle around that image, the vast domain of 3 continents drawing inward, growing quiet, settling into the peace of the night, the long drama of the centuries coming gently to its rest. The empire is gone now, a century in its grave, but its great monuments still stand under the stars, and its long story remains, and tonight you have travelled the whole of it, from the frontier at dusk to the city settling into the night. There is nothing more you need to follow now, nothing more to hold or to think about. The journey is complete. The centuries have all been told, and the great empire, having risen and reigned and passed, settles now into the quiet dark, into the deep stillness of the night, into rest. So let your own thoughts grow as quiet now as the sleeping city by the water. Let go of the day behind you and the day ahead. Let the images soften and blur and drift, the domes and the minarets, the gardens and the courtyards, the firelit pages and the quiet water, all of it dissolving gently into the dark. You have nowhere to be and nothing to do but rest. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the warmth settle through you. Let the bed hold you, and the dark be gentle, and the long story carry you down, the way the Bosphorus carries the lights of the city softly on the water, down and down into sleep. If some quiet thought remains as you drift, a place from tonight's long journey that stayed with you, a city or a story you would like to wander through on another night, you might let it settle in your mind, or leave it in the comments for me to carry you to another evening. There are so many more roads to wander, so many more empires sleeping under the stars, and other nights to travel them. But not now. Now there is only the rest, and the quiet, and the gentle dark. Sleep well, traveller. The frontier has gone dark, and the fires have burned low, and the long watch of the empire is over at last. The stars are out over Istanbul, and over the whole of the vanished empire, and over you. Let them keep their watch, and you, rest now. Rest and sleep, and let the night carry you gently down into the deep and dreamless dark. Good night.